Chapter 1636. Published at 20th of February 2023 8:17 and 41 seconds AM. Chapter 1636. Cleanse. 1. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel was already determined to prepare himself a bit first before he left, but now this was just affirmed all the more. It would be borderline idiotic for him to return now. He had to take advantage of the time where no one knew where exactly he was. While most would know that he had returned, this didn't mean that they could pinpoint his location. For now, he would just have to stay here until he was ready. It'll be busy for a while, maybe a few months, potentially less, Lionel spoke, turning to Aina. Currently, Aina held the big little black star in her arms. She didn't seem too surprised by Lionel's words. Considering his previous agitation, she had guessed that something like this was going to happen. Okay, I will wait, she said with a smile. Lionel nodded and left this place. The current segmented cube was enormous. According to Anastasia, it had a size about a quarter that of a normal-sized planet. Considering the population was not even 10, it was no wonder that it felt enormous. Right this moment, the segmented cube was like having a miniature Earth in his pocket. In fact, the only reason it hadn't begun producing treasures at the level of Earth was because Lionel hadn't been here. As such, Anastasia kept things as neutral as possible. Hearing such a thing, Lionel was actually quite surprised. Anastasia acted like someone who wanted to be in control of every tiny little detail, but it was clear that she actually wanted to defer to Lionel. Whether that was because she respected his father, or if she simply wanted to grant him this respect, or if it was something else entirely, Lionel didn't know. But what Lionel did know was that after accumulating so much force and even evolving so many times in his absence, the segmented cube was very much ready to explode forth with its potential. So long as Lionel gave the command, he might have even more natural resources at his fingertips than Earth could provide. At the same time, though, he was quite baffled. Just what kind of treasure was the segmented cube? In the beginning, Lionel was too ignorant to the ways of the dimensional verse to understand just how valuable this treasure was. Let alone the segmented cube, everyone awed him, so it was hard to see through to the specialness of this device that followed him everywhere. But now that his scope had been broadened, he understood that there might not even be a second treasure like this in all of existence. The segmented cube was basically an entire world capable of following him around on his finger. It could produce cleansing waters, something capable of countering even anarchic force. It concentrated force to such a great degree that practicing here was easily 10 times more effective than anywhere else. And even one of its first awakened abilities was as logic-defying as suspending a living, breathing entity in time. There was simply nothing else like it. And it was shocking to an extreme. It made Lionel wonder just what its origins were, how had it ended up in the hands of the Morales family, and why was it only in the third dimension when Lionel met it, since even he could take it to the sixth dimension with relative ease. Lionel could only put these matters to the back of his mind. Right now wasn't the time to be dealing with the growth of the segmented cube and its evolution path. Rather, he had to be in tune with himself and how he would take steps forward to succeed. The first thing Lionel did was sink into a river of cleansing waters. He didn't even want to think about where this river led to and just how much cleansing waters there were in this place. It just felt ridiculous. He couldn't understand how such a valuable item could be created in such large numbers. Still, whatever thought he had vanished the moment the water touched his skin. Despite the fact it was just gently washing over him, he felt the need to release a moan, his body feeling far more comfortable than it ever had before. His pores opened up, streams of a warm energy entering his body and gently caressing him. To Lionel's shock, he felt his lineage factors react, radiating a pure aura that only seemed to become more and more perfect. He didn't know what was happening and he almost forced the process to stop entirely, but that was when Anastasia's voice rang out. "Don't fight it, are you trying to waste a good thing?" Anastasia shook her head. The strength of cleansing waters was entirely dependent on its dimension, as were the number of its abilities that could be unlocked. But the root of the abilities of cleansing waters was in purification. Namely, it could bring something to its most perfect state. This ability wasn't exactly healing. Rather, it was entirely related to balancing energies. If one was poisoned, it could recognize that and expel the foreign material. If one formed force crystals of a certain caliber, cleansing waters could turn them into pure force crystals. And so long as the cleansing waters were at a higher or similar level in comparison to your lineage factors, it could even cleanse them and allow them to reach their own optimal states of perfection. This final ability was something that only appeared once cleansing waters entered the 8th dimension, and it was something that Lionel was experiencing right this moment. After consuming so many force pills, Lionel's foundation had become incredibly sturdy, and there was even more potential within himself now in comparison to the past. He had initially entered the cleansing waters because, as Aina had said, these pills had impurities that needed to be dealt with. What he didn't expect was that he wouldn't find these impurities, but would rather find something far beyond them in use to him. Chapter 1637. Published at 20th of February 2023 8:17 and 40 seconds AM. Chapter 1637, Cleanse, 2. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Compared to the process of eating force pills, Lionel felt like he was walking on clouds. After consuming the Cobra Demon, Lionel's bronze runes had all fused into one. If he activated his metal synergy lineage factor right this moment, he would become a man of bronze from the neck down. His halo would be far more resplendent, and the crown usually tattooed to his forehead would separate, fusing with the spear crown of his spear domain lineage factor and exuding a far mightier aura. Under the effects of the cleansing waters, it felt like a final push thrummed through Lionel's blood. The bronze sheen that covered his body from the neck down slowly separated from him, peeling off from his skin and becoming a light that covered him instead. His halo grew in size, shimmering with an even more fierce bronze glow, and at the same time, the sound of sharpening metal resonated through the air. What happened outside of Lionel's body was mirrored inside. His individual organs, which would also usually be covered in bronze runes, radiated a similar glow as well, as though they were enveloped by a light of ambrosia. There were actually no changes to Lionel's starry-tailed fox and Aurora Black Panda lineage factors for unknown reasons. But there were changes to his soul. It became more resplendent and whole, growing in strength and becoming more and more independent of Lionel's body. At the same time, the cleansed king's might that had always laid its roots within the depths of Lionel's soul also began to flourish, slowly becoming more powerful as time continued onward. Although Lionel had separated his soul from his body, it could survive indefinitely on its own like a spirituals could or someone with wise star order's ability index. At best, he could last a few hours. It couldn't be helped, he didn't have the practice methods of the spirituals. But Lionel quickly found that as his king's might grew stronger, so did his soul, and the vice versa was also just as true. It was hard to tell which was the root and which was the sprout, but what Lionel didn't know was that his king's might was only becoming purer, and the Emperor's might tablet that had managed to break free and follow him reacted very well to this change. When Lionel finally awoke, he could feel every cell inside his body tingling. Even his spear domain lineage factor had become purer, although the changes were nowhere near as exaggerated as what happened with his metal synergy lineage factor. This seemed to tell him that the spear domain lineage factor was much closer to perfection to begin with. Lionel looked down at his body and his skin seemed to glow. His muscles were much softer and far less chiseled in comparison to the past, but this only made sense since he had completely reset his metal body. Even with this being the case, though, Lionel still felt that this basic, untrained metal body was more than 100 times more powerful than it had been back when he was in the 6th dimension. The gap was simply enormous, and it would only stack further as he recultivated it back to its peak. Lionel exhaled a breath and stepped out of the river. The feeling of grass beneath his feet made him smile. He had never known that having his own personal forest could feel so good. When he returned to the Void Palace, he and Aina wouldn't have to bother with finding a place to live again. What place could possibly be better than this? Lionel smiled to himself and flipped over a palm to reveal Phila's emulation spatial force innate node. It was fairly large, at least compared to Lionel's innate node back when he snatched it back from Miguel, but it was still only about 2 thumb tips large. Lionel pulled out the innate node fusion method he had gotten from the exchange first and prepared to read it. He felt that this innate node would be a perfect candidate to replace the node in his brain stem with, so he had to be very careful and thoroughly understand the technique first. An innate node? Anastasia appeared over Lionel's shoulder, seemingly not caring that he was naked in the slightest. In fact, she had been watching the whole time. She didn't pay much attention to it in the first place. Humans, whether clothed or not, were all the same to her. "Are you sure you want to absorb that? It will cause more problems than not," Anastasia said. "I received a method of fusion from the zone we just exited," Lionel explained. "I think it was a mythological zone. It had all sorts of methods that I've never even heard of before, including a method to fuse with innate nodes that aren't your own." Anastasia's gaze flickered. "Oh. Is that so? In that case, put it in the river." "Huh? Put it in the river. Innate nodes can be cleansed too." Innate nodes are the purest state a force can reach, more than comparable to pure force crystals, but there are different calibers among them as well. Emulation spatial force is definitely a top 5 spatial force, so it's powerful and has 9th dimensional potential, but this innate node has a problem. It even feels as though it's been moved around a lot and never got the chance to properly grow, so it's missing a lot of the strength it should have for a 6th-dimensional innate node of its caliber. While Anastasia didn't know about the method of innate node fusion that Lionel mentioned, when it came to forces, her comprehension of them, and how they functioned, practically no one was he equal. And this was to be expected. After all things considered, wasn't she essentially the world spirit of the segmented cube? Who could understand more of the nature of things if not her? Lionel's gaze flashed. That was right. Thela had the ability index that granted one the ability to move their nodes and nodal pathways instantly within their bodies. This allowed such a person to cast techniques instantly without circulating their innate nodes first. To think that this ability would actually have a crippling effect on an individual with an innate node. But compared to this, it was shockingly impressive that Anastasia could see through this flaw in just a single glance. After all, she had never met Thela before. "Okay, I will do as you say, then." Lionel allowed the innate node to drop into the river. He wasn't scared about losing it at all. Everything in this world was under his control. It would only take a thought for him to make it appear in his palm once again. Anastasia nodded. "It won't take long. Just focus on learning the fusion technique." Lionel assented. Chapter 1638. Published at 20th of February 2023 8:17 and 39 seconds AM. Chapter 1638. Understanding if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. The fusion technique was definitely the best that the zone had, and Lionel had spent enough demon points to make certain that this would be the case. However, even it required at least a basic affinity already existing for the fusion to be perfect. Luckily, Lionel's dream force affinity was as high as could be, and he had more than enough spatial force affinity thanks to his ethereal star force. This met the basic requirements necessary for the fusion process. Once the fusion was completed and perfect, nothing else would matter. After all, by then, the base of Lionel's spatial force affinity would thus become his new innate node. Whether or not he kept his ethereal star force would become irrelevant by that point. In addition, due to the fact his innate dream force affinity was so high, the emulation spatial force innate node would be even more powerful in his hands. Unluckily, this technique was quite painful and was quite masochistic. It made Lionel wonder if he should still risk placing it within his brain stem. But then he remembered that his soul had separated from his body. Even if he couldn't endure the pain or made a mistake that could end his life, he was just one instant recovery away from perfection. Once Lionel was confident and Anastasia gave the go-ahead, he retrieved the innate node from the river. In these last few hours, it had grown more resplendent. Its runes were far more visible than the past, shimmering with a silvery gold light, and it had grown an additional thumb tip in size, now being about an inch thick and 1.5 inches long. Right now, it looked far more like a gem than it ever had before, and it gave off a feeling of absolute majesty. It even felt more weighty in his palm. Lionel brought out a stainless steel bowl from the lab and plopped the innate node inside. Then, under Anastasia's flickering gaze, he cut open his arm and began allowing it to pour inside. Lionel actually failed to cut his arm open the first time, having used too little effort. It seemed that he had underestimated his body despite the fact his metal body could currently be considered to be third-dimensional. With a second effort, he used his spear and opened up an enormous gash. With every flex of his arm, another huge wave of blood was pushed out, but even after several liters had come out, he didn't seem satisfied. Luckily, the recovery abilities of his body were astounding. He was more than capable of continuing on for a while. After the first 10 liters were drawn, Lionel stopped. He placed an injured arm over the bowl, and his eyes flashed. Within his dream world, the manifestation of a complex force art was created and Lionel flooded it with both dream force and spatial force. The complex force art split into 2 layers, one rotating clockwise and the other counter. As they did so, the blood in the bowl began to shrink at a visible speed, becoming lesser and lesser until all that was left was a familiar innate node which flashed with a crimson light before going back to normal. As though he wouldn't stop until he dropped dead, Lionel repeated this baptizing by blood ritual dozens more times. He wasn't meant to stop until he felt a resonance with the innate node, a certain connection with it that transcended just a physical connection. This took more attempts than Lionel thought. He had originally assumed that 3 would be enough, but even after 20 attempts and a face as pale as clouds, he still didn't get the result that he wanted. He could feel the connection after the 3rd attempt, but something just felt like it was missing, and he kept chasing after it. Anastasia couldn't help but shake her head. This father-son pair were really a duo of demons. Both forgot about everything else when they suddenly set their mind to something. A moralis was a purpose was a fearsome thing indeed. After almost 40 attempts, it finally clicked for Lionel. That's what I was missing. How do I fix this? Lionel's eyes suddenly lit up. At first he thought that maybe there was no such thing as a perfect fusion method, but then it hit him. Spirituals were a race born as souls, they built their bodies later. So why was it that wise star order said there was a genius among them with 9 innate nodes? Was it possible that this genius snatched it from others? Or was it that the capacity to form innate nodes was soul deep to begin with? This fusion technique seemed perfect to people who hadn't sensed their souls yet, which made sense since the region of the zone Lionel had entered had been ruled by humans just like himself. However, for those that had sensed their souls like Lionel, it would always feel as though something was missing. Lionel had already given this innate node more than enough of his blood. To this technique specification, he had already completed the first step perfectly and was ready to continue. However, Lionel knew that it was missing something. I got it. Lionel's aura changed and a rippling violet fog formed around him. With a surging momentum, he formed the duo of spinning force arts again. But this time, when he flooded the bowl with his blood, he infused it with a large amount of soul force, dream force, and king's might. It took several attempts, but Lionel was patient to an extreme. He didn't allow anything to distract him and he almost became sagely in that way. Finally, on the 121st attempt, Lionel felt a ringing sound through his soul. Lionel's comprehension of spatial force was probably the deepest out of all of his forces. To regain the segmented cube, he had put a lot of effort into research and meditation on it. However, in the past, his affinity for the force could only be considered to be average in part thanks to his first divine armor which used a spatial force or as its core. But now, Lionel suddenly felt like the spatial force of the world was whispering into his ears, wanting to tell him all of its secrets. Somehow, the feeling was even more overwhelming than what he felt from fire force, a force he was entirely unmatched in. That was when it sank in for Lionel and it felt ironic to him that it had taken so long for it to click, especially considering his usual disposition. He was a person who didn't like to rely on instinct, so why had he been relying on it all this time? When had he ever put in the effort to truly understand his dream force? What about fire force? Or his scarlet star force? Didn't he just always rely on his innate talent for it? And now, suddenly, spatial force had shot by them all in the blink of an eye, becoming his strongest force. And yet, he hadn't even fused with the innate node yet, he had only formed a connection with it. I was right. Lionel thought to himself. If I manage to grasp Grandpa's music and painting skills, I can step past it and use the method that I wanted to all along, force arts. Wasn't it force arts and the study of them that allowed me to understand spatial force so intimately? So why shouldn't I do the same with the others? This will be my path to grasping the pinnacle of force manipulation. Lionel's eyes glowed, and then he did something that nearly made Anastasia scream out. Commanding little Tolly to turn into a thin and sharp thread, he took control of his metal spirit to pierce it into the back of his skull. There wasn't even a drop of blood that leaked out, but Anastasia was caught between wanting to roar out in horror and curse Lionel into an early grave. Chapter 1639. Published at 20th of February 2023 8:17 and 38 seconds AM. Chapter 1639. Fine. Now if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. If Lionel hadn't managed to separate his soul from his body, he would have never taken this approach. The first part of fusion technique wasn't even the most masochistic part about it. What was truly the most sadistic part of this technique's creator's intentions was what came next. After the connection was formed with the innate node, it was necessary to graft the innate node into your body. But in order to succeed, it required a special process which was akin to branding your own body. But this branding would have to be from the inside, and rather than using fire, it required blades. Only by purposely scarring oneself would the fusion be perfect. Essentially, Lionel had to cut into his own brain stem. The pattern of these cuts had to match with two force arts he used to refine his blood with. The more sensitive the region, the more difficult it would be to succeed, but this was the price to pay for success. This was why, under normal conditions, Lionel would never dare to do this. At worst, he would just choose a less optimal region for this innate node, or he might even choose not to use it at all. But now, he didn't hesitate. Lionel not only didn't hesitate, but he also executed it all in one go. He chose a needling technique to form the force art. In order to complete it, little Tolly formed thousands of small needles at once, each of which was lined up perfectly to complete the force art. Lionel's body shuddered, but he maintained his sanity. He used dream sense to spread the pain out as much as possible, but even so, he still felt like he was on the verge of dying, his body refusing to listen to him. The brainstem was far too important to the function of the body. Even when Lionel had initially formed his node within it, he had to rewire the cell connections first before he could make space. This time, however, he simply directly damaged it, and lethally so. It was no wonder his body was shutting down. That said, he had already expected this much to happen, and he was ready. Rather than using his nerves to control his body, he let his soul take over. With a movement, he picked up the glowing innate node and pressed it to the flowing back at the back of his head. His body trembled. In the end, he was forced to use little Tolly to continue to apply pressure. The difference between this method and others was that other processes required cutting open wounds and hoping the innate node fused with you. However, with this method, although Lionel cut into his body, it wasn't to allow the innate node space to enter. Instead, this process would only succeed when the innate node sank into his skin, becoming a legitimate part of his body. Through this method, the innate node would become like something your body constructed. And, much like Lionel's other innate nodes, if he was ever to be eaten again, it would automatically become a central part of his innate recovery. Lionel collapsed, his body convulsing. The damage to his nerves made it impossible for him to control his body properly, and the pain was horrible. However, Lionel had already experienced being eaten alive. Every excruciating bite and chew was ingrained into his very memory. He would never forget those moments. Compared to that, what was this or any other pain worth, for that matter? The hours ticked by and the innate node slowly fused into Lionel's skin. After an entire day, it finally vanished beneath his skin and began to jockey for its final position. Anastasia had been shaking her head the entire time. She wanted to scream and berate, but she was somewhat afraid of interrupting the response. What would she do if this fool really died? Luckily, about halfway through the second day, Lionel's body twitched and he began to slowly recover control of his body. Step by step, his nerves reconnected and the wound to the back of his head also began to slowly close. Lionel opened his eyes, his breathing heavy and his face pale. It seemed that he was a glutton for punishment. Years ago, he would have never dreamed of doing something like this to himself. He still remembered how he almost gave up when opening just the first tier of his metal synergy bloodline, but now he was puncturing holes into his brain as though it was normal. He shook his head, laughing to himself. Well, I'm glad that you can laugh, but that was not funny at all. Are you incapable of giving a warning? You and your father are just the same, refusing to explain everything, always doing crazy things, never putting anyone in your eyes. Did you know that if this goddess were to reveal her true strength to the outside world, that tycoons of even the 9th dimension would fight tooth and nail for me? But you can't even bother to give a word of explanation. If I had my way, Anastasia released the rant that she had been holding in for hours already, the moment she noticed that Lionel would probably be just fine. She was very clearly much infuriated. She would have directly beat Lionel up if she could. Lionel laughed. It's fine now, isn't it? I had to do things like this. If I thought about it too much, I might have chickened out. Don't interrupt me, boy. I'm not finished with you yet. And what were you even thinking of forming your first node in your brain stem to begin with? Did you have a death wish back then too? I don't think I've even ever met anyone outside of you and your father that would do such a thing. Foolish, foolish, foolish. Each one is more annoying than the last, simply ridiculous. Lionel smiled but allowed Anastasia to continue throwing her temper tantrum. As for himself, he had already focused on these changes. Chapter 1640. Published at 20th of February 2023 8:17 and 37 seconds AM. Chapter 1640. Theoretically, if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel turned his internal sight into his body, observing the changes to his brain. This was the first time he had felt the ability to project dream force out of his body. Even though his starry spirit domain existed, it was ultimately still using something internal as a medium, and it wasn't quite the same. Lionel reached out a hand and tried to use it, and it almost felt magical. He formed a clone of himself almost immediately, and it really felt like he was looking right into a mirror. If Thela had still been alive to see such a thing, she would have likely been shocked into silence. She had already lost count of how much effort it took her to make a realistic clone of herself, but it seemed to be all too easy for Lionel. The root of emulation spatial force was in using spatial force to affect the environment and dream force to mask the spatial force. Essentially, the main characteristic was spatial force and its manipulation and control. Dream force was only considered to be a proxy. In fact, even now, Lionel felt that there was a certain limiter on him. He had much more dream force to use than this, but there was a bottleneck of sorts stopping him from pouring out all of the dream force he could. I see. My output of dream force would always be limited by how much spatial force I can output, since the two come in a package. My amount of dream force is great, but my amount of spatial force is lesser in comparison. However, if Lionel allowed his emulation spatial force to surge out of his new innate node. It flooded his body, filling his other nodes and nodal pathways. Suddenly, since he wasn't pulling emulation spatial force from the environment, the amount of spatial force Lionel had skyrocketed. A second clone formed, then 4, then 8. Eventually, there were hundreds, standing all around and exuding an aura almost identical to Lionel, and with a slight tweak, they were identical. Hundreds of naked Lionel standing in the midst of a forest was quite the sight to see. Anastasia could easily see through them, but that was due to her sensitivity and force to begin with. Lionel and his clones all reached out at once, causing a spear to appear in their hands. This spear didn't feel entirely perfect at first, but as Lionel played around and tweaked it, it too became more perfect. The most shocking part of all of this was that Lionel wasn't using his starry spirit domain. It was safe to say that if he did use it, all of this would only become more perfect. I wonder if I can. Lionel tried shifting positions with one of his clones like Thela had. This was an incredibly useful ability, and it would make him almost invincible in battle. He didn't believe that anyone would be able to touch the hem of his clothing if he could accomplish this. Not only was he able to create far more clones at once in comparison to Thela, but his dream force affinity was so far above most individuals that it would be hard to find someone who could see through his clones like he had Thela's in the first place. Lionel shifted, but his target clone vanished. In addition, his hundreds of other clones wavered, making it quite obvious which one was real and where the fakes were. Even worse, Lionel felt that he could only target clones a meter or two from him at best. This much wasn't too bad and could still be considered to be useful, but the fact his other clones almost vanished when he did so made it practically useless. Lionel frowned and tried again, and then again. He even tried lowering the number of clones, wondering if he actually hadn't seen Thiela's limit, but it was rather her choice to maintain mobility. However, even that didn't work. Lionel's frown deepened. Could it be? What are you doing? Emulation spatial force can't be used like that, or at the very least, it's not as good as other spatial forces in doing so. Just the same way not all water forces can freeze things, not all spatial forces are designed for movement. Emulation spatial force is a spatial force that is good at solidifying and giving birth to form and function. When matched with dream force, it can basically become anything. Everything, no matter what it is, has some effect on the space in its surroundings, and emulation spatial force uses this to create a replica. At its highest forms, it can even be indistinguishable for the original. Even if one has a high enough dream force affinity to tell the difference, it won't really matter because there'll be functionally no difference at all. If you wanted to teleport on a whim, this isn't the force innate node you should have chosen. Although Lionel already understood all of this, he didn't interrupt Anastasia. Instead, he waited until she was done and explained his reasoning. When Anastasia heard of Thiela and how she used the innate node, her own expression flickered, her gaze dancing with a peculiar light. Theoretically, it's possible. But this person has a far higher understanding and control of their force than you do. Lionel started. Do you know about force manipulation, Anastasia? Force manipulation? Anastasia raised an eyebrow. But when she listened to Lionel's words, her confusion vanished as she became more and more solemn. I see, so that's what it is. I didn't expect that there would be such a systematic method. From what you say, it sounds like this world has a method of drilling this comprehension into its youths and they can take this into adulthood. I've sensed the existence of such a thing before, but I've never consciously thought about it. It's that damned brat Velasco again, he never explains anything, he better not let me get my hands on him. Chapter 1641. Published at 20th of February 2023 8:17 and 36 seconds AM. Chapter 1641. Anastasia's understanding. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel blinked and waited for Anastasia to finish another tirade before he could finally start asking the questions he wanted. Luckily, Anastasia was very forthcoming. If I research it properly, I'm sure I can come up with some methods, but it will take time, and it's honestly probably best if you think of it yourself. From my understanding, force should be seen as a living, breathing entity even if it isn't one. How one chooses to manipulate it, even if the path ends up being the same, should be individual. For example, think of walking, or running, or throwing. These are things everyone can do and everyone does, but do two people ever do them exactly the same? Even if there are some mechanics that are more efficient than others, even for those that have reached the pinnacle, they wouldn't do it exactly the same, and there would even be some that shatter the mold. Force should be the same. Ultimately, the most powerful force is the one that comes from you or works well with you. If you take guidance from others on how to tap into this, it'll never truly be your own. That said, I think that I can give you some guidance. From what I understand, force can be divided into certain grades from their inception, and it's difficult for these forces to break out from their mold, but it isn't easy. Just like the example of running before, even someone who isn't gifted in running can still squeeze out more of their potential given time and effort. Lionel nodded slowly. This was like the rubber band example again. It seemed that Anastasia agreed with this sentiment. However, I would say that forces have far greater potential for increased strength. Whereas an untalented runner could never outclass a world-class long-distance runner or sprinter no matter how hard they trained, a force can because they ultimately have the same root. Lionel's brows jumped. Now this was new. He had never heard of forces having the same root before, but this did make sense. Ultimately, wasn't it all just energy? Even though the scope of a third-dimensional world was limited, there were many teachings of Earth that Lionel still held onto even now, and this was one of them. Energy could be transferred and changed, but it couldn't be destroyed. This should be true of force as well. There was a reason there were force crystals and pure force crystals. The natural state of force was to be together. And then there was neutral force, which was inherently an amalgamation of all force. Everything had the same root. If I'm correct, when forces break past certain limits, this should be the force manipulation you're talking about. And upon breaking those limits, forces begin to display strengths that they didn't originally have, even capable of crushing forces above them in strength. Theoretically, this kind of force, or a force that has broken its limits, should be the true root of the separation of dimensions. When a force that has broken through more limits meets one that hasn't broken through any, or even one that has fewer limits broken, it can directly suppress it. This will manifest as a higher dimensional being meeting a lower dimensional one and crushing them. Lionel nodded slowly. He had experienced this personally. Whether it was his speed of thought, his dream force, or his Scarlet Star force, all things that he had supreme confidence in, they had all been crushed in the face of Thela and the Cobra Demon. The Cobra Demon was an especially good example because their water force was relatively weak in its most basic form. And yet, it had easily been able to block and crush Lionel's Scarlet Star force with relative ease. If not for it making the mistake of eating Lionel, or if it had a method of sensing and attacking Lionel's soul directly, Lionel would have most definitely lost that battle. But luckily, the awakening of his soul allowed him to break free of the suppression his mind had been under, and his dream force finally began to work normally once again. But even then, Lionel's Scarlet Star force had been useless against the Cobra Demon until Lionel took advantage of an opening to deal it an even more severe injury. The gap between a force that had broken its limits and one that hadn't was simply far too large. Lionel fell into his own thoughts for a moment before he nodded. All right. Anastasia, can you still start working on the generic method? I have tons of force mantras here. Lionel waved a hand and caused the dozens of basic force mantras he had taken to appear, and I think that they could be of some help to you. I'll forge my own path, but it will still be good to have a generic method that others can use. It'll help my faction to grow stronger. Also, if the feeling isn't obvious, I'd also like to know when I have a breakthrough so I know if I'm headed in the right direction or not. Anastasia's eyes lit up when she saw the booklets and quickly caused them to shoot up from the ground and hover around her. She didn't even bother to respond to Lionel. She was already entirely focused on what was before her, even oh-ohing and ahang from time to time. Lionel chuckled and didn't mind it. Soon, he had re-entered a state of absolute focus. My spatial force comprehension is well beyond that of my others, but I haven't taken the time to understand emulation spatial force in specific. The kind of understanding I have about spatial force right now is heavily biased toward movement-type spatial forces with a hint about storage type which might potentially be applicable. Anastasia is right. Emulation spatial force is more about stacking space, giving it form, using it to attack and to defend. Movement is at the bottom of its list of capabilities. And, if I want to use it like Thela did, they'll have to invest time into researching spatial force in this sort of lane. But for now, there are more important things. Once I finish reconstructing my metal body and my divine armors, we will walk down that road. Lionel smiled. It's been too long since we've crafted together, buddy? Asterisk bloop asterisk little Tolly rushed around Lionel's fingers and armors like a flashy silver snake. The little guy's excitement was at an all-time high. Chapter 1642. Published at 20th of February 2023 8:17 and 35 seconds AM. Chapter 1642. Settled. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel restarted from the very beginning, using herb ore to build up his foundation just like he had from the very beginning. However, the herb ore he used this time couldn't be compared to the last in the slightest, and that was because he tempered this herb ore with cleansing waters first. Much like with force crystals, the essence of herb ore, or ores in general for that matter, could be segregated into pure and impure. Lionel hadn't been aware of this the first time he began his journey in cultivating metal body, but after seeing the effects the cleansing waters had on his new innate node, he easily extrapolated these matters toward other potential applications. He found that after using cleansing waters, the amount of essence one needed for an ore to be considered whole dropped by as much as half. This meant that an ore tempered by cleansing waters could produce the same effects with less volume used. This was a huge discovery. If Lionel had known this ahead of time, of the billions he had spent purely on resources in the exchange, he could have put much of it toward other resources. It was already too late to change this, but all was not hopeless. After all, if Lionel looked at things from a glass half-full perspective, then this meant that about half the resources he had were suddenly freed up. He could still use these to exchange for more wealth, or better yet, put them toward more crafts. Now that Lionel had returned to the human domain, he was extremely wealthy. It had to be remembered that his mother had left billions worth of ore for him. His wealth was comparable to most seventh-dimensional individuals, and even dwarfed a good majority of them if he really thought about it. But when building a faction, one couldn't have too much money. There was simply no such thing. As Lionel absorbed the cleansed ore, his body was filled with a unique feeling. It felt almost as though energies were softly massaging every inch of him, gently caressing the contours of his figure. It was an elevating sort of experience. The energies flowed smoother and Lionel's pores seemed to sing. He already would face no bottlenecks up to the sixth dimension, but he suddenly realized that he would hardly face them in general if he always used cleansed ores like this. It wasn't long before Lionel's body reached absolute perfection in the third dimension. Despite the fact he had used pure ore, Lionel actually absorbed much more now than he had in the past. In fact, the gap wasn't just a few kilograms. The amount he needed was truly astronomical. In the past, due to his metal body barely breaking into the fourth dimension, Lionel had been able to battle well above his dimension. Of course, his enemies back then had also been mediocre talents, but the sentiment was still true. Now, his current metal bodice foundation was even more exaggerated and there was a difference of at least 100 times. With such a gap, even if he was facing the premier talents of the human domain back then, his battle prowess would be just as impressive. Lionel smoothly entered the fourth dimension, the smooth edges of his body becoming rougher and more defined. However, even with this being the case, he maintained his flexibility and he didn't feel that his body had gotten heavier. Metal synergy was considered to be the best defensive lineage of the human domain, being it lacked the usual weaknesses. That said, it was more accurate to say that these weaknesses were instead less prevalent rather than being eliminated entirely. Lionel had still experienced his body becoming exceptionally heavy in the past and he had to practice flexibility techniques to ensure that he didn't become too stiff in his movements. But now, these problems seem like a thing of the past. The pliability of his body didn't change in the slightest. In fact, because he had just reconstructed his body after being eaten alive, he had the range of movements and flexibility of a newborn. There was no tension in his body whatsoever. As for his weight, he felt like his gravity domain had become so much more refined. Rather than applying it to his surroundings, he could apply it to individual portions of his body, making his punches as heavy as a moon if he so wished it. The gravity domain of his lineage factor was one that Lionel used rarely, honestly because he had too many abilities to choose from. It wasn't often powerful enough that the use was worthwhile, especially since Lionel spent so much of his time fighting individuals so much more powerful than himself. Now, however, he felt that it had the potential to become far more of a staple to his battle prowess. His control had reached the point where he could even apply it individually, making his spear as heavy as a mountain or his arrows more piercing than an enemy could contend with. After Lionel was finished calmly analyzing the changes to himself, he waved a hand and caused the next stage of tempered ores to rise out from the river. The ores formed into two even piles and would be the foundation of his fourth-dimensional metal body. As expected, they fell into two piles, one for water force and the other for life force. There were two kinds of water force ores that Lionel had chosen. One emphasized the defenses of water force and the other emphasized the heaviness of water force. Void Star Force was a water force known for its defenses, but the method by which it did so was also important. There was a reason it was named Void Star Force, and that was because when manifested, the force was akin to a black hole. Not only did it have a huge amount of density, nothing could make it past it, swallowing everything in its vicinity whole. Thus, Lionel wanted high affinities for water forces with high absorption capabilities and density, thus he settled on these two categories. Chapter 1643. Published at 20th of February 2023 8:17 and 34 seconds AM. Chapter 1643. More than enough. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel took a similar approach for Vital Star Force. Vital Star Force could be considered to be a type of life force, but it was also very strict and defined in its usage. It focused mainly on vitality. In this way, it was very similar to blood force, but it had its differences as well. For example, Vital Star Force was also very heavy as it was primarily a star force as opposed to a life force. These sort of subtle differences seemed unimportant, but it was exactly what separated those who could fully grasp their forces between those who were both lost and weak. Lionel felt that if he had to grasp Vital Star Force in the future, it would be incredibly important for him to understand these small differences. In his current understanding, Blood Force was a vessel for another power source while Vital Star Force was the power source. The latter was like a nuclear reactor, bursting with potential and producing a constant, large stream of power, while the former, Blood Force, was a gentle stream and focused on longevity. Lionel understood that this understanding was incredibly limited and could only be considered to be rudimentary, but it was more than enough to lay a foundation for where he would go in the future. As such, he likewise chose two categories of life force. One focused on burst energy, giving one a second wind, one the brink of death. The other a constant power source, pumping one full of energy over a long and continuous time. For Lionel's water forces, he chose mud ore to stand in as his heavy water force and wave ore to be his defensive water force. Mud ore didn't sound very appetizing, but Lionel didn't care about this, he only chose it for its abilities. Mud ore was known to be sticky, persistent and resilient. It was actually a rare domain type or which could cause changes even to the environment itself. Wave ore was one known to be the core of many top-tier black-grade water force defensive treasures. It was able to face an attack and erode it in continuous waves. Although it wasn't initially powerful, it was likewise persistent. By the time it reached the person the attack had targeted, the attack might not even have 10% of its original strength. Once again, this was also a domain-type organ. As for his life forces, Lionel chose two vein-type ores. The first embodied bursting life force. This ore was known as Second Wind Oregon. It was usually designed to be the vein pattern of a pendant-type treasure. According to usual crafting practices, this ore would be surrounded by another ore of a specific element. Once the pendant was activated, the treasure would shatter and immediately convert the whole of the element that surrounded it into power for the user. This was essentially like storing a second body of force within yourself. However, Lionel obviously wouldn't be able to use this ability when he absorbed the Oregon. What he wanted was the underlying mechanism of this ability. In order to work, this ore had to be able to quickly turn any kind of force into usable energy for a battle without a long process of adaptation. What this essentially meant was that it was a catalyst that was compatible when any body that it was attached to. This ability was the purest kind of life force there was. The words Anastasia had spoken had truly resonated with Lionel. She had equated comprehending a force to being like running. The way Lionel interpreted that was to mean that the action of using force was no different from any physical action you might take. Lionel had always seen force to be a separate part of himself, something that he pulled from the environment to use temporality. But Second Wind Ore was able to use its life force characteristics to take any force and make it a part of you immediately. What did this mean? It meant that it could very well be that the foundation of life force itself was this ability to make force a part of a person. And maybe, life force, since it represented life itself, was precisely the force that connected humans like Lionel to all other forces as well. When Lionel looked at things like this, he felt like he grasped exactly what the core of Vital Star Force was. Maybe, Vital Star Force was just able to take the most vibrant energy source there was in the whole of existence, the star, and catalyze it into power usable directly by the body. When Lionel grasped this, there were already changes to his stars. In fact, right this moment, his 3 vital stars formed their complete 3rd and 4th dimensional star runes in one go. Lionel smiled, feeling that he was on the right track. So, rightfully, his second life force ore was one that didn't convert energies, but rather provided a large amount of energy. This ore was known as Longevity Jade Oregon. Longevity Jade ore was considered to be both a vein type and domain type Oregon. In addition, it was a lot like herb ore in that there were multiple stages of this ore all the way up the dimensions. Lionel planned to fill himself to the brim with this ore at every single stage. He would follow this formula for every step of the way. Longevity Jade ore would stay the very same and the others would change, but the balance he would have would be unmatched. The end result would be a body that was both almost impossible to injure, and one in which, even if it were to be injured, had a healing factor that would reach an incomprehensible level. Lionel quickly made his way through the 4th dimension, his body radiating a delicate glow with every step forward he took. He also required much more than he had in the past to reach saturation at these stages as well, but he had long since been prepared for this, trading for more than enough. Chapter 1644. Published at 20th of February 2023 8:17 and 33 seconds AM. Chapter 1644. Condense. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel absorbed a final bit of mercury ore, heavy waves of silvery light wafting off from him. His presence alone seemed to make the surrounding air heavier. He opened his eyes, exhaling a breath. He had just reached the very limits of his Tier 1 6-dimensional metal body. Of course, in doing so he had opened the next set of gates in his metal synergy lineage factor and had, as such, stepped into the 6th dimension with his body, allowing his strength to undergo a qualitative change. Lionel didn't bask in his own glory for much longer. Although he felt that he was particularly powerful left, he was still focused on other things. With his metal body complete, he now needed to create 3 sets of divine armors. The first 2 would replace the 2 that he had lost, and the final one would become his 6th-dimensional armor. Lionel had already decided to sync his metal body and divine armor. This would bring out the most of his strength, and this also meant that he had to lean upon the same path he had chosen to take, which meant water force and life force. Lionel believed that his path of water force was just fine. In fact, he even planned on using the exact same ores he had used to form his metal body on it. However, he wanted to do something different with his life force. Ultimately, his divine armor was meant to be a tool of battle. Lionel didn't want it to be too focused on support and not have enough attacking prowess. So Lionel wanted an armor that could maximize defenses, yes, but he wanted the life force aspects to boost his strength rather than just his vitality. Luckily, he had the perfect framework to make this work, and that was to rely on star fusion. He wanted his armor to be able to accumulate and use a huge burst of energy all at once, qualitatively boosting all of his other abilities at once. This meant that he needed a life force not just capable of allowing its user to make use of and connect to other forces, but a life force also capable of reversing this connection and allowing such forces to flourish by virtue of its connection to it. Vital Star Force was one of the best examples of this, but Vital Star Force was a fusion of forces that worked on just one kind of force, Star Force. In addition, Vital Star Force was far too high level of a force to be found and used in divine armors at lower dimensions. Although Lionel's metal body was now in the 6th dimension, his divine armor technique worked exactly the same as his metal body technique. Although they could synergize, one had to build it from the ground up. That said, Lionel already had a solution for this. For the 4th dimension, he picked an ore called Surging Tide Oregon. For the 5th dimension, he picked an ore called Instant Resonance Oregon. And for the 6th dimension, he chose an ore known as Central Pillar Oregon. All of these ores had different names, but they all had one main ability, and that was to bolster other forces, albeit to varying degrees. In addition, they all used life force as a basis, working beautifully with other Oregon. Each and every one of them was a foundational type or just like herb ore, and they functioned as such. In the past, Lionel could only pick one central ore to build his divine armors around. However, now, his scope was on a completely different level. He planned to forge all of his armors to the life grade. When they were complete, they would be considered to be one whole. As such, the evolution or would thus be effective on the entire armor instead of just a portion of it. This meant that Lionel's fourth-dimensional divine armor wouldn't just be quasi-fifth dimensional, it would truly be fifth dimensional. And this likewise meant that his sixth-dimensional divine armor would be truly seventh dimensional. Lionel got to work immediately, delicately refining each one of his blueprints. Before he even began on the first one, he formed all 3 blueprints first. Lionel's aspirations were actually beyond just forming life-grade divine armors. He wanted his armors to resonate with each other, borrowing strength from each predecessor. Lionel had realized that after he formed his second divine armor, because they didn't follow the exact same path, their resonance wasn't perfect and they couldn't borrow strength from one another. The result of this was his first divine armor becoming almost meaningless. After making a mistake once, Lionel definitely wouldn't make it again. If he did this properly, all 3 divine armors would practically become like one entity, exuding far greater strength. When Lionel was finished with the blueprints, he got to work immediately. Maybe in the history of the human domain, there had never been a mere fourth-dimensional, or black-grade treasure, constructed with so many parts. Lionel remembered that his first divine armor was barely a few dozen parts, but now this one was easily into the hundreds and it would only grow more complex. However, his state of focus was so deep that he didn't even seem to notice. His movements only became faster and faster with every passing moment, a dense auspicious air hanging over him. His force quill danced in one hand, his other hand dancing with an impossible speed in the air. He formed each individual part with conviction. If there was even the slightest mistake, he threw it away and restarted. In the end, he even finally deployed his starry spirit domain, blanketing the region with his dream world. His connection with little Tali grew even stronger, and his pace touched upon a greater level. A smile graced his features. It had been too long since he felt this feeling. Crafting truly made him feel at home. Nothing would escape his control. Condense. Chapter 1645. Published at 20th of February 2023 8:17 and 32 seconds AM. Chapter 1645. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel punched out, his action being followed by a sharp whistling sound. He could feel the wind stacking up against knuckles, his punching speed too fast for the particles to get out of the way any faster. If he pushed just a measure faster, he was certain that he'd be able to shatter the sound barrier, a feat that would be shocking considering the fact that this was an eighth-dimensional world. With a thought, a clone of Lionel appeared, however the original Lionel didn't use it immediately. Instead, he continued filling it to the brim with solid spatial force, making it harder and more robust. Then, without moving an inch, Lionel allowed the clone punch him with all the force it could muster. Bang! The sound reached Lionel long after the punch landed on his chest. Vicious winds kicked up and his hair was sent flying backward with such force that it even looked as though it wanted to rip away from his scalp. As usual, Lionel's hair grew a great deal after practicing his metal body, but even so, he had long since cut it down to size once more. Even still, the effects were so exaggerated. However, Lionel didn't move a single inch. The source of this content is N0V//Elbin/. Nady's skin seemed to ripple with a formless energy and with a bang. The clone he had taken so long to form shattered into pieces before his eyes, unable to withstand the strike at all. Lionel nodded lightly to himself. When he took so much time and effort to build a clone, its strength wasn't something that could be casually dealt with. In fact, it was probably much stronger than his previous self. And yet, it couldn't even withstand hitting Lionel with a full-powered blow. The current Lionel's defenses could not only be defensive, but they had a certain offensive quality to them as well, taking Candle's ability as inspiration. Candle had the ability to form mirrors that could both reflect and multiply attacks she faced. She was a terrible headache to face and Lionel had only defeated her originally by outsmarting her. Considering how many decades of training she had under Anastasia and Y's Star Order, it was doubtful that he would be able to replicate this feat without quite some effort on his part. Of course, Lionel's abilities weren't so exaggerated. He could only reflect a portion of an enemy's strike relying solely on the abilities of his body, but this was where the beauty of his Tier 4 control ability index came into play. Using the flexibility of his newly constructed body and his absolute control over every aspect himself, even does to the individual cells. Using this control, Lionel could take advantage of his metal Bodis' innately water-like characteristics to redirect the flow of energy that collided with him and use it to empower him. In homage to Candle, he called this ability Dream Mirror. Essentially, Dream Mirror used his bronze runes, or what might more accurately be called his bronze aura, to redirect the force he experienced. Like this, he was able to replicate Candle's ability within range of his bronze aura almost perfectly. Unfortunately, the key word was almost. While Candle could accomplish this feat with almost any force or attack, Lionel could only do so with physical attacks. In addition, said physical attacks had to be blunt as his effectiveness against piercing attacks lessened drastically. Of course, there was good news as well. With Lionel's current bodily defenses, even attacks that could technically be classified as piercing would still be ultimately blunt in his eyes. If one didn't have the strength to pierce through his defenses, there was really no difference between a sword blade and a punch, they were all the same. In addition, although he could redirect and multiply the strength of forces like he could physical attacks, he could still convert whatever impact they had against him into a physical output so long as they also couldn't break his defenses. After reaching this state, Lionel returned to his calm. By now, his naked body exuded a perpetual bronzed glow. It made others feel as though he was wreathed in a halo constantly, like he was separate from the normal world of humans. When matched with his vascular physique and his hair which also seemed to exude its own pale violet light, he looked to be far more like a spiritual than a human. Lionel flipped his palm over and a familiar gorgeous spear appeared. It had a bright golden, harpoon-like single-sided blade, and a radiant white body covered in hexagonal scales. No matter how one looked at it, it looked far more like a work of art than a weapon of war. The faint sound of dancing and sharpening blades resounded around Lionel as closed his eyes, focusing on the movements of his spear. Due to his time in the zone, Lionel had had an opportunity to learn a lot more about resonance and its potential applications. As that experience accumulated, there was a subtle feeling tugging him toward a certain direction. Listening to and feeling the resonance of spear force had become a method to increasing his strength by leaps and bounds. Even though Lionel hadn't stepped into the sixth dimension with his spear force, after mastering poetry and calligraphy, his spear force had strength by huge leaps. So, wouldn't the same happen if he applied music and painting as well? However, had he truly mastered it? He felt like could always create more powerful lines, more powerful words to give wings to the feelings in his heart. It didn't even feel like these words had to be particularly tyrannical, or that they had to continuously one-up each other. That feeling in his chest, those emotions he wanted to embody. They all felt like they were the most important. What was that image his uncle had been trying to draw before he ran out of energy and stopped in dissatisfaction? Wasn't it just a simple spear? There was nothing grandiose or oppressive about it. The difference was in what his uncle wanted that spear to embody. That was where the strength lay. Chapter 1646. Published at 20th of February 2023 8:17 and 31 seconds AM. Chapter 1646. Weightless. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. By this point, Lionel's life force affinity had reached an unprecedented level, at least in comparison to his former self. This allowed him to see through things he hadn't been able to in the past, and he had even come to understand just where Aina's instincts came from. Life force was the core of it all, the root from which the connection to all things was formed. Lionel wasn't the kind of person who liked to rely on instincts. He wanted to truly understand something before he could apply it. This was the way he liked to work, and it was also part of the reason that he was so powerful now. While one might say that he could be more powerful if he simply entirely relied on his talent, was this really the case? If not for his analytical breakdown of calligraphy and poetry, would he have mastered it in as little as a year? If not for his structural understanding of Biyao force and its applications, would it naturally progress so far? If not for his analytical mind, would he be half the force crafter he was today? One might say that it was precisely because of his talent that he was able to progress so far and so quickly in things like Bao force, but was that true? He didn't have a Bao force lineage factor, but he definitely did have a spear force lineage factor, so why was the latter lagging behind the former? The Bao just worked better with Lionel's personality and way of viewing things. Certain weapons had their own methods of interacting with the world, some of which Lionel understood, and some he didn't. The Bao, the sniper rifle, or throwing weapons, were all weapons of skill, patience and calculation. The spear, however, wasn't necessarily like this. In fact, the spear was probably the most primitive weapon in all of existence. From its inception, it was barbaric and unrestrained. This simply wasn't a weapon that fit well with Lionel's personality. The source of this content is N0V//Elbin// Netus. Lionel continued to move in silence, his heart calm and his thoughts flowing like the waters of a gentle stream. He thought back to Old Man Hutch. Hutch had always wanted Lionel to listen to his weapon, to feel its presence, to let it talk to him. Lionel had always found these things to be worthless. No matter how obstinate the old man was, he couldn't be bothered. He didn't like doing things he couldn't understand. In fact, that stubbornness even led him to not even asking the dictionary about spear force. He didn't want anything to influence his path forward. It wasn't actually quite accurate to say that Lionel didn't like the idea itself. What he didn't like was the lack of logic behind it. If there was logic behind the training method that required him to run around a city naked, Lionel might think about doing it. It wasn't the actual process that was the problem, it was the lack of reason behind it. These were weapons. They didn't have hearts and souls, nor did they have consciousnesses of their own. Talking Abbott, listening to them was asinine. However, this felt different. What Lionel was listening to right now wasn't the weapon, he was listening to its resonance with his life force. How it interacted, how they fused, how they repelled one another. The so-called life of a weapon didn't come from the weapon itself, it always came from the wielder. This was why Lionel could say a word like, die, and yet have it wield so much more power than a poetry verse 100 times more complicated. This was the true root of calligraphy and poetry, and for that matter, it was the true root of music and painting as well. Lionel's spear swished through the air. Golden streams of spear force flourished, the delicate sounds of chimes ringing. However, astonishingly enough, if one closed their eyes and internal sight off to Lionel's existence, this delicate music would vanish. The instant one focused on Lionel once more, though, the music would return, its gentle cadence soothing the heart and soul. The melody changed and it became voluminous and oppressive. Just observing one would feel as though they had been trapped in a maelstrom, every pierce, every sweep and every chop feeling like another piece of their life had been severed away. But then everything changed once more. Lionel's absolute domain faded, the swishing sounds of sharpening blades fading into the background and a gorgeous scene was painted by them instead, delicate flecks of golden spear force dancing through the air, adding to the beauty with every stroke. Lionel switched between countless stances. Each and every one painted a new picture and exuded a different kind of aura. Towering mountain made his spear towering and heavy. Streams of rivers made his spear swift and winding. Starry skies made his spear vast and endless, its blade capable of reaching any point with just a single pierce. But even these images began to slowly fade. As time passed, the melodies became quiet, lacking even the whistling of the wind. Soon after it, the vast images created by strokes of golden spear force also vanished, shrinking further and further until there was nothing left but the slightest radiance of a white gold spear. Everything became deathly silent, but Lionel's movements had never stopped and his eyes had never opened. After a certain point, he couldn't even feel the grass beneath his feet or the wind against his body. He felt as though he was gliding through a voice, the only feeling he could experience being the weight of the spear in his hand. He couldn't even feel the special characteristics of the spear in question. It was as though everything had faded but the embodiment of a spear. Not the spear or a particular spear, but just a spear, an amorphous construct without form or presence. And eventually, even the weight of that spear vanished. In the real world, the white gold spear in Lionel's hand seamlessly vanished to be replaced by a jet black rod, radiating a dense black fog. And then, Lionel pierced forward. Chapter 1647. Published at 20th of February 2023 8:17 and 30 seconds AM. Chapter 1647. Understanding himself. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel woke up with Aina on his chest. After finishing his training, he didn't hurry to do things with the tentacle womb or other faction building things because after a while, he suddenly felt the need to just spend time with Aina. When his spear force perfected its fusion with the final stage of his grandfather's path of the spear, Lionel's mind entered an odd state of relaxation where he suddenly understood that understanding himself was even more important than understanding individual forces. Anastasia's words, when taken to the logical extreme, precisely meant these things. Ultimately, just like with his spear force, the life of his forces didn't come from them, but rather himself. While they all had their own preferences and leanings, they were ultimately in his control. Running was always designed to be faster than running. By the same token, throwing was always designed to move things from your hand into a further distance. The same assignments could be made for walking, swimming, talking. Any one of these activities were things everyone and almost everything did naturally. They all also had the same exact purposes, regardless of who was executing them. However, did any two individuals do them the exact same way? Lionel had come to understand that he should treat force in this way as well. When he used force, he actively did something that was the equivalent of running, or walking, or swimming, or even talking. However, he had always treated it as an external thing, not putting enough time and attention into them, much the same way that anyone could run, walk, swim, or talk, but not everyone could do these things as effectively as another. And the route to reaching prominence in these facets was to first understand oneself. When it came to walking, you learned through trial and error as a child. When it came to running, you did the same thing. For swimming, it was the same once again, and it was even the same for talking. All of these things were forgotten by most as they happened so early on in life, but Lionel could remember those memories clearly. He could remember every failed attempt and reattempt. He could remember how he had to learn to shift his balance to adjust to his own body, not the other way around. Likewise, if he wanted to understand these forces, he would have to learn about himself as he learned about these forces. When he came to that conclusion, Lionel chose to relax. He awoke Aina from her meditation and brought her to leisurely stroll around the segmented cube. Aina was confused at first and didn't quite understand what the point of this was, but she realized it was rare for her to spend this kind of leisurely time with Lionel, at least not without someone or something wanting them to die. As time passed, she completely forgot that she didn't understand what was going on and why Lionel did this and simply smiled, enjoying her time with him. The relationship between Lionel and Aina had always been one of fiery passion and emotion. They danced between life and death, and even when they weren't, they were completely immersed in their training. There was nothing to see in the segmented cube aside from the beautiful ambience of nature, and yet it was so novel to them to casually view such sights that it was endlessly fascinating. The two talked endlessly, saying and talking about anything for days that quickly turned into over a week. And when they ran out of things to talk about, they simply felt silent. They didn't feel the need to fill the quiet air, the soft sounds of their breathing was enough. This was the closest moment to normal the two had received since the metamorphosis descended. It was hard to fathom, but since that last day of high school, the two of them had never had even a single moment of rest. The source of this content is N0V//Elbin// net. It was always battle after battle, war after war, death threat after death threat. Very soon, they would likely have to return to such a life, but at least for now, they felt at peace. Lionel reached down from Aina's waist and pinched her ass, causing her to stir awake. She slapped Lionel's hand away and adjusted herself on his chest before falling asleep again. Lionel laughed to himself. Alright, one more day wasn't too bad. Although the two of them hadn't crossed that final step yet, he had definitely made this little vixen pay for her earlier arrogance. Lionel wasn't very disappointed about this fact. Every time he and Aina seemed about to cross that line, it was always due to a state of fiery passion. The first time it was because Aina didn't want to lose Lionel, the second time the two of them were made at one another's approach to dealing with danger, and the third and most recent time Aina had had a large amount of Lionel's blood in her system. After these days of calm and leisure, while that passion wasn't as fiery, it burned a lot more like an eternal fire, one that would last a lifetime. When that flame did finally boil over, he was sure that it would be worth the wait. After one more day, as promised, Lionel and Aina finally left the segmented cube, crossing over the void battlefield as they made their way toward the void palace. With the speed of the segmented cube, they crossed over large distances without much issue, shuttling through vast amounts of anarchic force as though it wasn't there at all. Half a month later, they made it to large gates once again, facing a vast mountain range that was several planets' widths wide. However, the state of the void palace wasn't like what Lionel remembered at all. Matched with its imposingness, a bloody scent hung in the air. In fact, what once were majestic gates that no one had to care about guarding because the prestige of the void palace was impregnable now had permanently stationed troops. As a result, the arrival of Lionel and Aina didn't go unnoticed. Chapter 1648. Published at 20th of February 2023 8:17 and 29 seconds AM. Chapter 1648. Shocking news: if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel stepped out from the segmented cube holding Aina's hand. He allowed it to shrink, becoming a finger band once again as he stared forward. At that time, a large number of auras pressed down, causing him to frown. This place actually couldn't truly be considered the Void Palace. In reality, it was one of the cities that formed the last line of defense on the Void battlefield. Lionel and Aina had been to this city before. It was the very same city they had come to after leaving the Rapak's nest. Right this moment it was even larger and more imposing than before, even having troops stationed on the outside and along the walls. Lionel couldn't imagine why you would need a vanguard stationed outside of the city when the defenses were so great to begin with. But since he knew so little about the situation after being gone for so long, he didn't question it too much. Instead, he waited for the small squadron that was approaching to finish their approach. However, by this point, Lionel had already recognized the individual leading this small squad. He was Rowan Cancer, the very same young man who had tried to take advantage of Lionel's injury after he led them all out of the Rapak's nest in order to target Aina for her token. Back then, Aina had ended up killing a large number of Rowan's followers, but Rowan himself had managed to escape. It had been a long time since then, just over a year to Lionel and likely much longer than that to Rowan. Now, the rookie from back then who had entered along with Lionel was already strong enough to lead a squad here. So in all likelihood, Rowan neared the top tiers of galaxy-ranked disciples already, or might even be a sector-ranked disciple by now. It would mostly depend on what sort of talent he was. Rowan, of course, recognized Lionel and Aina as well, although his gaze was just as placid and emotionless as usual. However, that didn't change the fact he had some waves rising and falling in his heart. Lionel and Aina had just come back and clearly didn't understand the usual protocols. And, just about a month ago, the spatial phenomena that had had the human domain in its grips also came to an end. These two things were highly unlikely to be a coincidence. Although there were others who came very recently as well, given the odds, Lionel was definitely the top three most likely to have been the reason they could return. Of course, this was only to the general public. To the elders paying attention to these matters, they had already confirmed it with 100% accuracy. While Rowan was considered to be the most likely to inherit the Cancer family in the future, he didn't have that sort of cash just yet, and as such, he could only make his own guesses. But the fact that this guess of his was so accurate already spoke volumes. The source of this content is N0V//Elbin/net. Please display your disciple badges. Despite recognizing Lionel and Aina, Rowan still asked this. In fact, he also pretended as though the trio of them had no prior history and that he hadn't tried to kill Lionel not just once, but twice. Lionel calmly looked toward Rowan and flipped his palm over to reveal his badge. However, to his surprise, rather than just casually looking over it, both his and Aina's badges underwent several layers of inspection before they were finally allowed to take them back. Although his first reaction was to believe that Rowan was purposely making things difficult for him, Lionel didn't act on this, mostly because it made little sense. Delaying them by an extra few minutes for the sake of something so petty made little sense. In addition, these guards seemed to have specially created devices purely for the sake of inspecting his badge, something that made little sense unless there was a good reason. You two can enter the city now. Lionel put his badge away and scanned the squad again. Is there a case of people impersonating Void Palace disciples? Lionel asked. Rowan's eyes flashed before he nodded slowly. Yes. The cloud race has encroached onto our territory in recent decades and has become more brazen. In addition, areas we used to hold firm control over have weakened drastically. Now that Earth has entered the 7th dimension faster than was expected, our enemies have re-upped their efforts and are pressing us. It's also the case that during the spatial phenomena that just ended, the region was incredibly unstable, making it difficult for us to safely maintain a defensive line, but simultaneously very easy for enemies to cross large distances into our territory via teleportation. So this is the situation now. Lionel's brows jumped in surprise, but the squadron which followed Rowan was equally as shocked. Rowan was a man of very few words and they had never heard him speak so much all at one time like this. But he had done so for this individual? Who was this, exactly? The number of people that could recognize Lionel by his face were simply too few in number. He had only spent a short time in the Void Palace and hadn't interacted with enough people to truly build fame. While the event of him clearing dozens of floors in his first attempt at the Void Tower was circulated, that was also more than 2 decades ago and the amount of things that happened since then were too many. Seeing this now, though, Rowan's squadron seemed to understand that Lionel must have been a prominent figure before the cataclysm. Lionel, though, was shocked by something else entirely. It seemed that in his absence, Earth had become a name even the geniuses of the Void Palace was very familiar with. Not only that, but in just a short 20 or so years, it had actually become a 7th-dimensional world already and a vicious storm was brewing around this matter. Chapter 1649. Published at 20th of February 2023 8:17 and 28 seconds AM. Chapter 1649. Asks if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel calmed himself and nodded. Is there anywhere I'm supposed to go after this? Lionel asked. Yes. All those who have just returned from the zone must report to the Void Senate. As for the details, they'll inform you about them. Lionel nodded and took Aina's hand again as they entered the city to use a teleportation platform to the core of the Void Palace. As for his thoughts, they were much less calm than the rhythmic cadence of his heart. The Cloud Race. He knew about them as well. They were a race of people adept at mimicry. They could freely change their forms and embody whatever their eyes could see. When Lionel first learned about this race from the Void Library, he was quite confused. After all, Wise Star Order had told him that humans were the weakest of the races because they couldn't focus their attention down one path. Then how, exactly, was the Cloud Race so powerful? Shouldn't they be even weaker than humans following this logic? Well, the truth was, the Cloud Race was near the bottom of the barrel along with humans and the Dwarven race, but they were still considered to be stronger than the both. This was because the mimicry of the Cloud Race was all focused on one thing, countering. The Cloud Race were experts in defense and using your weaknesses against you. This style of battle made them exceptionally powerful, and while they couldn't be considered to be at the pinnacle of the most powerful races, they were still well known to be superior to the humans. Ironically, though, it was precisely because of this that the humans fared so well against the Cloud Race. Because humans weren't as homogeneous as the other races, countering them took time and effort, and true human geniuses might be able to defeat Cloud Race geniuses before said genius could get a grasp on their abilities. Still, the fact that the Void Palace had suddenly become so cautious against the Cloud Race must mean that by the time Lionel was gone, they must have made great headway into grasping the secrets of the human domain. If the Cloud Race wanted to wage war against the humans, they didn't need to understand all of them, they just needed to understand the weaknesses of the greatest powerful among them. The Morales family, the Seared family, the Constellation Alliances, Shield Cross Stars, the Crafting Guilds, the Constellation families, So long as these few powers were grasped, who cared about the weaker humans? They weren't good enough to match up again even normal cloud race members to begin with. The less complex the talent, the easier it was to counter on a whim. It wasn't long before Lionel stood at the base of a mountain, looking up. He knew that the Void Senate was up there, but this was actually the first time he had been to his place. At the bottom, there were people present to escort them up, and they were soon brought to an office. When Lionel and Aina entered, they found a black-haired man sitting across from them behind a desk. He didn't look up even after the door closed, but this aura did seem to grow heavier. Just from a glance, Lionel could see that this man was missing an arm, one of his robe sleeves behind decidedly looser than the other. By the time an entire minute passed, Lionel's eyes had narrowed into slits. While Rowan wouldn't know that he was the reason everyone could return, how could someone who could sit at the top of the Void Senate not understand? And even if they assumed that it was Aina and not him, wasn't Aina right by his side anyway? And yet, this man hadn't said a single word since they entered. Looking back at the man's missing arm, Lionel's furrowed brows loosened and his expression became calm. There was a better than 70% likelihood that this was the man his father took the arm of, and likely also the catalyst for what put the sword and spear factions at each other's throat. Lionel didn't know what was going on with that situation now, or if the two factions had set aside their differences to face a greater threat, but judging by Rosen's reaction, that much was unlikely. Rosen seemed to sense that Lionel's demeanor had entirely relaxed, and he suddenly looked up, his gaze piercing. It truly felt as though a pair of swords were hidden within the depths of his gaze. An invisible aura shot forward, as sharp as a blade, but when it entered an unknown radius of Lionel, it dissipated into the wind, leaving Rosen with narrowed eyes. Lionel didn't even seem to have moved a single inch or down anything. But in reality, neither did he. The procedure is simple, Rosen said emotionlessly. Here are the documents. Write down everything you've experienced in the zone, catalog all of the events by day for all exactly 63 days that were inside. Do not miss a single day. Also, document all treasures that you've received from the zone. The Void Palace will not take any of them, but will inspect them, categorize them, and then return them to you in a timely fashion. This is only for the benefit of knowledge and the progress of humanity into the future. We will not steal from our students. If you've understood, take these documents and leave. Lionel's gaze flashed. As expected, it was highly unlikely that he would be the only one to benefit from the zone. Still, there was one question that left him baffled until this point. He had forgotten about it because he had met Aina and she seemed to be just fine. But why was it that his cousin and the others couldn't use force or their ability indexes while he could? Could it be that there were others who were able to use their force like he and Aina, and as such had managed to gain treasures of their own? Lionel reached a hand forward and took the documents for both himself and Aina, ready to leave. There's also one more matter, Rosen said lightly as Lionel was about to depart. For you, especially, the Void Palace would like to thoroughly understand the method you used to break the cardinal rule of zones. Please don't miss out on any details. Lionel remained silent and didn't respond, but his thoughts were already racing. How should he handle this matter, exactly? There was absolutely nothing wrong with either Rosen's words or the Void Palace's asks of him. But his instincts were pulling him in a different sort of direction. Chapter 1650. Published at 20th of February 2023 8:17 and 27 seconds AM. Chapter 1650. Second method. Same problem if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Lionel sat in a hall of the Void Senate in silence. Aina sat by his side, looking at the documents as well. Though, when she sensed Lionel's odd mood, she looked over as well. Lionel's gaze was a bit unfocused, but his pupils continued to flicker as though he was calculating something. The decision wasn't a simple one. Logically, there shouldn't be a problem with helping the Void Palace, but there were too many potential issues with doing so, especially since there were still signs of traitors in their midst. The only people he could trust aside from himself were Aina and his parents. The ask of the Void Palace was very reasonable. Wanting to document the treasures of that zone made perfect sense, and they would also return it. In addition, wanting to know how Lionel had escaped also made sense. Who knew how useful such information could be in the future? If they could patent an ability to escape zones, there would be many zones that they didn't dare to easily enter previously that they could finally start exploring with full effort. For example, now that Earth had entered the 7th dimension, for the first time, the human domain had to contend with 8th dimensional zones. But the number of characters who wielded such a level of power were far too few, and they were so important to the backbone of the human domain that they couldn't possibly enter to risk their lives so easily. This resulted in a situation where there were many zones with potentially excellent resources inside that no one dared to make use of. But if these zones were allowed to linger for too long, then the territory of Earth would end up swallowed and destroyed. If that happened, what was the worth of everything else? Earth had suddenly become integral to the prosperity of the dimensional verse, and it was very likely that everyone had been waiting precisely for Lionel to return so that they could understand how he did it. Lionel obviously understood all of this, but what would happen when he revealed that this was only possible because of the unique characteristics of the segmented cube? Unless someone could create a treasure of equivalent stature, it would be a fool's dream to attempt an escape from a zone. In order to force the bubbles of the human domain and a zone to connect, and thus expel all outsiders from within the latter, it required the travel of a spatial item between the two. Said spatial item had to have enough structural integrity to survive the journey as well, or else it would all be useless. Essentially, you needed a treasure on a level close to the 9th dimension, or at least at the very cutting edge of the 8th. In this regard, the segmented cube was practically one of a kind. In the past, Lionel had simply assumed that every family in the human domain would have a treasure of this caliber. But the more he learned, the more he came to understand just how ridiculous such a thought was. In fact, he was certain that the existence of the segmented cube had a grand backstory Anastasia would probably refuse to tell him about, and in such a case, where there only existed one solution, just what would happen? He had just learned that the cloud race was making efforts to infiltrate the human domain and impersonate their kind. And he had already deduced that there were likely traitors at the highest echelon of the Void Palace, or else certain things just could not have happened that way. If these individuals suddenly learned that there was only one item in the human domain capable of breaking the rules of the zone, and said item was in the hands of a Morales family member, what kind of situation would that put the Morales family in? However, if Lionel lied about how he had done it, the moment they attempted to use his method and realized that it didn't work, not only would the human domain lose whoever had entered the zone, he would also gain the ire of the human domain and things would end up terribly regardless. If I had known Earth was already in the 7th dimension, I wouldn't have returned so easily. Lionel closed his eyes and sighed. Lionel suddenly felt a soft hand slip into his and he smiled lightly without opening his eyes. The source of this content is N0V//Elbin/ net. He had already known that there would be trouble like this when they returned, the only surprise was that it had actually come so quickly. But since he had already chosen Aina over the world, was there even a need to regret it? Lionel's heart shuddered and his thoughts flashed. When his eyes snapped open, they had a blazing light within them, but they quickly dimmed. Even if I've thought of another method to escape zones, it still doesn't change the facts of the matter. Lionel flipped a palm over and whispered, "Valiant Seal." A miniature trio of revolving pillars forms. This was another one of Lionel's self-created techniques. He had formed it using the Valiant Pillars of Valiant Heart Mountain and Camelot's magic system as a foundation. That treasure was designed to take control of zones. Theoretically, Lionel believed that if the power to control zones was harnessed and then forced into vessels like the segmented cube, then it should be possible to use them like the segmented cube's world to escape zones. If Lionel refined this method over a few weeks, he could easily hand this method over to the Void Palace and solve the potential issue of having the Morales family become everyone's target. But if he did so, this method would fall into the hands of the human domain's enemies as well. The problem is still the same. Lionel thought to himself, squeezing Aina's hand lightly. To think that he would be clever enough to think of such things, only to be faced with the dilemma of whether to share them or not. As Lionel was lost in thought, the clicking of heels echoed through the Void Senate's halls. When he looked up, he found a woman with vibrant green hair walking. He didn't think too much of it, until, that is, the woman's eyes emitted a coldness upon meeting his gaze. Chapter 1651. Published at 20th of February 2023 8:17 and 26 seconds AM. Chapter 1651. Triana, if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel met her gaze, his expression calm. Judging by this person's expression, she was definitely one of the Vierer family. But considering the fact she was casually strolling through the Void Palace Senate, the number of people she could be was drastically lowered. The odds that this person was precisely the Triana Vierer that had been harassing Lionel and Aina with her green thread faction. This woman sure knows how to hold a grudge. It's only been a year for me, but statistically speaking, it's been at least 10 years for her depending on when she was expelled from the zone. The fact that she still has the mind to look at me so coldly is asinine. Lionel hadn't forgotten the things this woman had done. He hadn't even gone to find her yet, but she seemed to have stumbled into him first. There were simply certain things that Lionel found to be unacceptable. He had already chosen Aina over the world once. Did this woman believe that she would get off scot-free after ordering her men to not only attack his Aina, but to even do something as demeaning as stripping her down and hanging her up for everyone to see? Despite the calmness in Lionel's eyes, there was a hidden oppressive aura within that hung in the air. He didn't care how long he had been gone for. Triana could count herself lucky that this was the Void Senate and not just any place where Lionel could act as he pleased. He looked away, ignoring her. He crushed the valiant seal he formed in his palm and flipped his hand over. With a rush, a surge of dream force came out of his hand and caused the documents to light up. The so-called documents were just a few pendants. One was used to record their experiences and the other was used to note down their treasures. Both would be handed in along with the treasures that they received from the zone. Others would probably take a few hours, maybe even longer, to finish. But Lionel was someone who had managed to read the entire history of law of the Void Palace in just a few seconds. Now that he had returned even stronger, noting down what occurred in just a 2-month period, even if it was incredibly detailed, took almost no effort whatsoever. In fact, while he finished, he also noted to Aina what she should disclose and what she shouldn't. His decision had been made. Once he was finished, he stood, having taken no more than a few seconds total to finish everything. The moment he stood, he found Triana just a meter from him, her gaze sparking. Lionel had had many thoughts on how this interaction would go, but what he didn't expect was what actually happened. Without a word, or even an attempt to communicate, Triana's palm suddenly shot forward. What was shocking, though, was the fact that this palm wasn't aimed for Lionel, but rather Aina, who still had her mind within the pendants, marking down everything Lionel had asked of her. The truth was that making up stories that could fool the Void Palace elders was incredibly difficult. They would be able to pick out the deficiencies in your claims far too quickly. Their minds at that level worked no slower than Lionel's own a few paces back. So, when Lionel had told Aina what to write, he went into great detail. After all, he was very familiar with what she had experienced and could adjust it as such. Due to this, Aina hadn't even noticed Triana's appearance at all because she couldn't split her mind to the same degree Lionel could. Right then, Lionel's calm expression became frighteningly cold. With a single step, he blocked the path to Aina and struck out, the speed of his fist being incredibly swift. Bang! Palm and fist met, sharp winds whistling into the surroundings. Lionel's body glowed with a bronze aura, dispersing Triana's strength and adding an extra boost to his own. Triana took 3 heavy steps backward, her gaze flickering with surprise. Even though physical prowess wasn't her strongest suit, she was still a Tier 6 expert of the 6th dimension. She shouldn't need to use her strongest abilities to deal with the likes of Lionel, especially since she had attacked first. However, what Triana didn't consider was the fact that Lionel could be just as unruly and unreasonable as her. Someone else might ask her why she had attacked or give her time to recover, but Lionel simply didn't care. He took another strong step forward, the rhythm of his movements causing the ground to vibrate. Bang! A cone of wind followed his punch, colliding with Triana's face without a care for her beauty. The source of this content is N0V//Elbin/. Net she flew backward and crashed into the wall of the void Senate Hall, the commotion spreading far and wide. Lionel walked forward as Triana's vision spun. He picked her up by her neck, and only then did he speak for the first time. "What did you mean by doing this?" His voice was doused in a chilly wind, his hand clawing around her neck with a menacing grip. "Halt." At that moment, a surge of aura rushed toward the location, many of whom were completely surprised. No one dared to cause a commotion in the Void Senate, its dignity simply couldn't be encroached upon. And yet today, it had actually happened. When they converged, they were shocked to find that the person dangling with her feet in the air was actually Triana. Triana was almost too famous in the Void Palace. Despite being from a relatively average family when the wider Void Palace was taken into account, she managed to form a monopoly over the medicinal factions that only increased after the cataclysm. Just a year ago, she finally managed to reach the heights many could only dream of, and she entered a party of the Senate with thoughts of returning to her faction in the future and raising it to the status of a party as well. But who would have known that this famous individual would be humiliated like this in the Void Senate? It was then that someone from Triana's party arrived, and this person had a bow strapped to their backs. Chapter 1652. Published at 7th of March 2023 3:26 and 4 seconds p.m. Chapter 1652, LLL concealed. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel didn't look at anyone else, an ill intent blazing in his eyes as he looked toward Triana. By this point, Triana had recovered, only to realize that her neck was already under the control of a junior. First she felt shocked, then humiliated, before a towering fury erupted forth from her in a torrent. She didn't seem to care that Lionel had control of her neck. As though she would rather die than not dare to struggle, her force rose like a tempest, a violent pressure blasting against Lionel's body. Clang! 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 The sounds of Triana's force rebounding against Lionel's body sounded no different from metal clashing with metal, and he was even forced to slide back a measure. At the same time, the grip he had had on Triana's throat was forced open, causing his eyes to narrow. Lionel had never seen anyone expelling force from their neck like that. Could it be a method that had already existed in the human domain? Or was it something that she had picked up from the zone? Triana released a shrill shriek, her rage forming several green vines of force that lashed out toward Lionel like a whip. By the time they crossed the small distance between the two, they had gone from barely formed to a shimmering emerald. It looked as though flexible gems were lashing out toward him, each of them carrying a lethal intent. Lionel's gaze was frighteningly cold. He didn't have any intention to kill. If he had, how could Triana have escaped from his grip so quickly? If you gained control of an opponent's neck in real combat, the battle was over. But Triana had clearly taken advantage of his state of mind to escape. It only took Lionel an instant to see through this, his intent only growing colder. Just when it seemed that Triana's vines would shred him to pieces, his absolute spear domain suddenly manifested, a golden vortex of sharp blades rotating around him and ripping Triana's attack to shreds. Lionel pressed two fingers together and pierced them forward. In that instant, it felt like everything in the world had come to a chilling pause. The silence was deafening. From a large commotion that had caught the attention of most in the building, it felt like they had suddenly entered the vacuum of space. There were no sounds of sharpening blades, no trembling walls and floors, not even the whistling wind of Lionel slicing the air in two could be heard. Triana's eyes only had time to widen before her chest was pierced through. There wasn't a single drop of blood for several moments as she fell backward, her eyes wide. It was only after she fell to the floor that her body jolted and a pool of blood quickly formed, drenching her green dress in a tide of crimson. "You!" From their shocked state, the first individual rose up roaring. This man was none other than the very man who had come from Triana's party, a man with a bow strapped to his back. It wasn't at all convenient to use a bow in an enclosed space like this, but the young man was so confident in his abilities and control that he didn't even hesitate to pull out his own. All he could see was red, believing that Lionel had just killed Triana. From the roar to the release of the bowstring, there wasn't even a span of half a second. There was no doubt that the drawing skills of the young man were exceptional, and it only became more clear after his six-dimensional bow force shot a streaking light through the void Senate hallway aimed right for Lionel's head. Lionel frowned, his cold gaze shifting in the direction of the young man. He had already locked eyes on him before his bow even left his back and watched the entire process of loading and firing. The young man might have thought that his speed was fast, but could it be faster than Lionel's senses? The arrow appeared between Lionel's brows in an instant. It almost looked as though it had teleported there from the bow it had just been released from, prepared to take Lionel's life. However, Lionel didn't even move. Clang! The arrow rebounded upward, rapidly spinning through the air as its bow force tried to continue forward without it. But the moment the bow force tried to harm Lionel, it was as though it had vanished into the wind. With the very same two fingers he had used to pierce toward Triana, Lionel drew an arc through the air, snatching the spinning arrow out of its motion with even quicker movements. Then, in one swift motion, his back flexed and he took a small step forward. Bang! The arrow rocketed out from his throw like a ball out of a cannon, moving with so much speed that it didn't even arc through the air. Rather, it drew a line through the hallways, appearing before the young man in an instant. The arrow shot through the raised bow which was prepared to shoot a second arrow, snapped the bowstring in two, before burying itself into the chest of the young man. The party member coughed out a mouthful of blood in astonishment, still not quite believing what he had just seen. Had his arrow really been so casually dealt with? How was that even possible? Right that moment, the door to Rosen's office opened and he stepped out with a stern expression, his armless sleeve whipping in the wind beneath his aura. Feeling the presence of a seventh-dimensional expert, no one dared to move even a single inch as Rosen scanned the surroundings. To think that someone would actually dare to make such commotion right outside of his office, weren't these people a bit too brazen? When Rosen saw not just one, but two students with bloody wounds through their chests, his expression became even colder. His gaze snapped toward Lionel, an ill-concealed distaste flashing in his eyes. Chapter 1653. Published at 7th of March 2023 3:26 and 2 seconds p.m. Chapter 1653. Neither if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. This is the Void Senate. The words were unhurried and didn't seem to have any extra emphasis, but the moment that they were spoken, it was as though a heavy mountain had fallen onto the shoulders of the spectators. Among them, there was no doubt that Lionel experienced the greatest pressure there was. You too, 1 year in the Void Mines. As for you, 10. The two Rosen mentioned were without a doubt Triana and the youth with an arrow in his chest. That meant that the last was most definitely Lionel. Lionel's gaze flickered. He knew the rule book of the Void Palace front to back, so he was also well aware that this punishment was actually in line with proper practices. Rosen hadn't taken a single step out of line. Still, wanting him to spend 10 years mining for a conflict started by someone else was impossible. If Rosen thought Lionel would really do that, he had another thing coming. Sensing Lionel's gaze, Rosen met it. Seemingly wanting to see if he would dare to refute, in fact his placid gaze almost seemed to beg for it. In the past, he had been much more brazen, even arrogantly kicking out the stalwart polearm party from their position as joint majority. However, ever since that, even with Lionel's father, he had hidden much of his sharpness, stoking a flame deep within his heart to push onward. In these 20 years, 14 of which he had been back for, he had progressed by leaps and beyond, already surpassing his former rival, Uranus of the stalwart polearm party by a large margin. Still, even with this being the case, he still hadn't revealed that hidden sharpness. Uranus was nothing but a defeated opponent, he didn't deserve his effort. The only man that was in his eyes now was Velasco Morales. Every day, he persevered through training most couldn't imagine just for the faintest chance that he could return the favor for this lost arm of his. In truth, he didn't even put Lionel in his eyes, and why would he? There was a far deeper pride ingrained within him. It had to be remembered that Rosen didn't send the youths to the Rapak's nest to target Lionel in the first place. His only intention was to help Amory get a leg up for his sword domain tribulation. As for the youths that had targeted Lionel, they were exactly that, youths. He simply didn't care to. But, if Lionel was going to blatantly spit in the face of the rules of the Void Palace and get in his way, thinking himself to be as great an obstacle as his father, Rosen wouldn't mind showing him the disparity between the two of them. And yet, Lionel only smiled lightly. With a flip of his palm, he brought out his two pendants and directly shattered them. Rosen's pupils constricted. Lionel's movements weren't exactly fast, but it was still impossible for him to react. At the same time, although the pendants didn't look special, they were still incredibly sturdy materials. Breaking them at Lionel's level shouldn't have been such a casual action. In fact, it should have taken quite a bit of strain. What do you mean by this? Rosen asked just as unhurriedly. Lionel blinked, almost as though he was confused by the question. Mean by what? Rosen's gaze narrowed. This Lionel, when it came to pissing people off, there was no doubt that he was no less proficient than that father of his. It was almost a crime that such a charismatic smile could be coming from such a bastard. It seems that you want to test my patience. Lionel thought for a moment before nodding. 10 years is indeed a long time. I guess that even for someone as old as you, it can be considered a while as well. Rosen felt his heart twitch. It had been a long time since he had felt something like this. After losing his arm, nothing seemed capable of fazing him, and the state of his heart was as clear and still as water. But he suddenly felt the need to punch a hole through Lionel's face. Lionel's expression didn't show much of a change, but he was coldly smiling on the inside. What a ridiculous rule. Just because he had injured someone who attacked first, he had to waste 10 years of his life while they only had to exchange a year? Even if that was indeed what the rule book states, he didn't care. These people liked to claim that he only had this level of attainment in the Void Palace because his mother had handed it to him, right? They had even stripped him of his rightfully earned galaxy rank because they couldn't fathom how far he had climbed up the Void Tower. And now they wanted him to mine or for them for 10 years? Sure, that was fine. In that case, Lionel wanted to see if they'd be willing to wait 10 years for his method of returning from a failed zone too. Since they wanted to play a patience game, they could play together. In fact, he would show people what true unfairness looked like. Did he break the rules? Yes, he did. What were you going to do about it? The reality of this was that Lionel could choose to just leave the Void Palace as well. After all, the Void Palace wouldn't detain people against their will, at least not for something so inconsequential. It was more accurate to look at it like Lionel exchanging 10 years for a chance to remain in the Void Palace after his punishment years were through. But if they really chose to follow through with such a punishment, Lionel would just directly leave. And if he was no longer a disciple of a Void Palace, then that would also mean that they didn't have a right to ask him about his treasures, nor did they have a right to ask him for a method of escaping failed zones. When that crossroads was reached, the Void Palace would have quite a decision to make. Deal with Lionel and get the information they wanted, and face his old man's revenge on the back end. Or simply let Lionel go. Neither of these things were what they wanted to do. Chapter 1654. Published at 7th of March 2023, 3:25 and 59 seconds p.m. Chapter 1654. Proven right. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel knew that he would likely be the subject of a plot very soon. In fact, he didn't know if this was a scheme or not, although he felt that the potential that it was just about 10%, likely less. Rosen carried too important a position in the Suyard family, and though the Morales and Suyards were always at each other's throats, Lionel didn't believe that they were incompetent enough to have a traitor at such a high ranking, nor did he believe that the Suyard family itself was a traitor to the human domain. In all likelihood, this was really just a coincidence. But that didn't mean that the scheme wasn't coming. In order to deal with that inevitable end, Lionel had to position himself properly while also squeezing out as many benefits as he could from the Void Palace in the meantime. Even though this would piss a lot of people off, and there might even be some people on the side of humanity who thought his actions to be too selfish and abhorrent, all he cared about was the end result. For now, They would treat him as public enemy number one, but when the time came that he wiped the three-finger cult from existence, they would come to understand the actions he would take this time around. Rosen slowly nodded to Lionel's words as though he was confirming what he was hearing for himself, and ensuring that this was, indeed, reality. This was likely the first time in the history of the Void Palace that a student of the sixth dimension dared to act in this way. Although Lionel hadn't said it in so many words, this was no doubt a threat. This singular young man suddenly held what was likely the fate of humanity by the balls, and he had such a sickening smile on his face. Anyone seeing such a scene would have a hard time telling just who was the hero and who was the villain. It felt like the moment Lionel had chosen Aina over humanity, he stopped caring about those details as they simply didn't matter to him. He had already resigned himself to the fact that many people would die due to his decisions, but he still felt that this was the only path forward. In his time in the dimensional verse, he had taken the life of almost 1,000 people. In fact, he knew the exact number 932. This was a number that accounted for the human domain and zones. If he accounted for the number of lives that he had taken via second-hand means, meaning through his commands, or his schemes, the number was easily tenfold that. If he chose not to be hypocrite and accounted for the number of demons and beasts he had killed as well, the number was at least twofold of that. He had come a long way from the teenage boy who almost allowed his life to be taken by a young woman because he couldn't bear the sins on his shoulders any longer. A very long way. The clarity he felt now was unlike anything he had ever experienced. Those few days of quiet harmony he had spent with Aina had taught him a lot, and it made him understand a large measure more about himself, and namely, the weight he had accepted on his shoulders. That day in the Rapak's nest, he had allowed his father to take that burden away from him for a time. But now, it was about time he took that burden back. Standing there, facing a seventh-dimensional expert who wanted nothing more than to take his life, Lionel stood tall and proud, his gaze unwavering and his smile calm. Those watching such a scene suddenly felt like they were watching a standoff of two equals. No, it even faintly felt like Lionel was on a level all to his own. Even in the face of someone more than just a single large dimension ahead of him, he could still maintain such an air. Rosen finished nodding his head, giving Lionel a deep look. "I will relay your words properly." Lionel chuckled. Relay his words? What words had he spoken, exactly? At that moment, Aina awoke from her focused state and looked around with a hint of confusion. Seeing the bleeding Triana to Lionel's back and the young man with an arrow in her chest, her lips couldn't help but twitch. She had been lost in her own world for all of a few minutes, and yet this trouble magnet had gone and done it again. "Don't look at me like that, this time it's your fault." Aina rolled her eyes, but didn't bother to refute Lionel's words. After handing her pendants over to Rosen respectfully, Aina allowed Lionel to take her hand and they both strolled out from the Void Senate. Those watching couldn't help but feel waves rolling in their hearts. For some reason, they felt that there would be a big upheaval in the Void Palace very soon. "I will let this matter go once. All future conflicts must occur outside of Void Senate grounds, including all branches. This is a rule that has been written in stone and cannot be violated. If there is a second time, I will triple the punishment." Rosen left these words behind as he turned and left, his gaze a frightening and chilly cold. Not long after Lionel, Aina and Rosen left, the members of Triana's party came rushing over. Some spectators remained in this area precisely to see this matter through, as Triana's party was not simple at all. In fact, it was among the so-called silent majority, a group of up-and-coming newly established parties that were beginning their attempt to become the replacement for the stalwart polearm party. In fact, even the stalwart polearm party themselves had been promoted once again and become part of this silent majority. Everyone had said that Lionel's generation was the most talented the human domain had ever seen, and time proved them right. The vast majority of the heads of this silent majority were precisely the very youths that Lionel had entered the Rapak's nest with. And, as though that wasn't enough, one of the executive positions of Triana's party was led by a young man who Lionel was very familiar with. A young man who had even threatened not just Lionel, but the whole Morales family in the past. He was none other than the only other young man to master sixth-dimensional Bao force in the fifth dimension alongside Lionel, a genius of the constellation Bao Alliance, Sagittarius. Chapter 1655. Published at 7th of March 2023 3:25 and 57 seconds p.m. Chapter 1655. Prestige of the Void Elders. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Rosen was a man of his word. After he left the Void Senate, he entered Void Peak to seek an audience. Even for the current Rosen, including all of his improvements, he couldn't casually come to this place without reason. And, even in the case he did have a reason, he still had to be respectful and patient. These individuals, the Void Elders, represented the very pinnacle of the human race. Together, the power they held was enough to be the face of the humans, and it surpassed any individual family. If this wasn't the case, how could they dare to claim to raise the future generation of leaders? The Void Elders were formed of a group of men and women with no affiliations to the large families or organizations. They were existences who, over the course of history, could have built up their own families and powers, but instead chose to forsake this path and become the beacon of humanity instead. As a result of this, the Void Elders had no ties to the major families. There was an obvious reason why this was a good thing. After all, this would ensure that the Void Elders didn't have any special ties to the students and didn't try to steer the Void Palace toward any particular direction. In fact, they were incentivized to ensure that the Void Palace remained power, because only when the Void Palace was powerful would they have the backing they had forsaken after taking up their posts. The sacrifice of the Void Elders didn't end here. These characters weren't allowed to have relationships, and they also weren't allowed to have children. Their entire lives were dedicated to the Void Palace. Any new Void Elder was raised up directly from the Void Palace itself. They made their vows early, and they were monitored and nurtured to replace the previous batch as they grew old and passed on. Such individuals couldn't be affiliated with any power families or organizations before entering the palace, and they were also the only ones who would receive the personal nurturing of the Void Elders. In fact, they couldn't even join factions or parties in their youths, as this could be considered another form of forming relationships and potential biases in the future. Lionel himself had met one such person before. This individual was none other than Cornelius. Knowing all of this, it was no wonder why everyone was so respectful of the Void Elders. This respect was deeper than just their power, but it was also a function of their sacrifice. If these individuals wanted, they could have formed powerful families of their own, adding to the chaos of the human domain. Instead, they chose peace and unity, laying down their pride and becoming just one piece of a greater whole. The prestige of the Void Elders in the hearts of the masses was not small, and it was also due to this that Lionel's father wasn't very well liked as the only person who didn't give the Void Elders their due respect. But today, it seemed that another of the Morales family line would be smacking the faces of these exceptional characters as well. Before Rosen stood three elders. Without fail, all three of them looked to be exceptionally frail, as though they might use the last of their life force at any moment. And yet, Rosen didn't dare to be the slightest bit disrespectful. Such individuals, the fact they seemed so ordinary was precisely what made them so fearsome. Their level of control was on a level all to their own. Two of these elders were older women, with one of them being a man. Of them, only one of the women didn't use a cane, and all of them wore black robes embroidered in gold. They gazed toward Rosen with murky eyes that carried a hint of anticipation. It was rare for these elders to be so curious and eager about something, and it was even rarer for three of them to appear for just a mere Rosen's request. Obviously, this was a special occasion to them. How could it not be? The spatial storm phenomena had just come to an end a few months ago, and they had already received a report that Lionel was back. They were all certain that Lionel was the one who allowed all of them to return, because his life signature was the absolute last to come back by a small fraction of a second, just after Ana's. This meant that he was the true core of everything that had happened. Only a select few individuals knew of this, but they had all been waiting for Lionel to come back a long while now, all for over a month to pass since then. They had been worried that something went wrong, but luckily everything was just fine. Now they could finally get the answers they were hoping for. Void Elder Vimark, Void Elder Galien, Void Elder Lisbeth, Rosen bowed respectfully. Much like Cornelius, even Void Elders were all called by their first names, their last names having been discarded. Vimark, the only male of them, waved a hand and smiled. No need for such formalities, just pass the pendants to us. We've been truly eager these last few days. It's rare for us older timers to have something to be excited about. About this, Rosen started slowly and explained the events from start to finish. He didn't embellish anything because he simply didn't have to. All that was necessary was to describe things exactly as they had occurred. As Rosen continued along with his story, the smile on Vimark's expression slowly faded. Although none of the three showed any fury or rage, their placid indifference placed a heavy weight on Rosen, who wasn't even the subject of their potential anger. Rosen summarized the events quickly. I did not dare to make a decision personally, so I came here to speak to esteemed Void Elders. The three Void Elders fell into silence, not answering immediately. Chapter 1656. Published at 7th of March 2023, 3:25 and 54 seconds p.m. Chapter 1656. Aged hands. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Rosen lowered his head and waited patiently for a reply. He didn't dare to rush these figures who stood at the same and sometimes even far greater heights than the elders of his own family. This was especially so since elders of the Void Palace tended to live far longer than normal humans for reasons that were unknown to the wider population. This allowed them far more time to accumulate, and their strength couldn't be underestimated. Having heard Rosen's story, the Void Elders understood what had happened. They were even able to deduce some of what had likely started this. But, likewise, they were also able to guess at some of Lionel's thoughts due to him brazenly taking such actions. The conclusion was quite obvious to them, and they felt that Lionel was still a little too tender. It was clear that Lionel didn't truly want to hand over this method, and the matters with Triana and her party had just given him an excuse. It's a bit amusing, Galliena, the only one of them to not use a cane, spoke. It seems that he's learned a bit too much from his father. Compared to the other elders, although she looked just as old, she also seemed to have a perpetual deep frown tattooed onto her brows. The way she clasped her hand behind her back and stood as straight as a spear despite her age spoke volumes. She looked as though she could step onto a field right this moment and become a drill sergeant. The other Void Elders didn't respond to this immediately. It seemed that they were still thinking of ways to deal with this situation properly. They were the Void Palace, not some hell house. They couldn't just capture students and torture information out of them. What would that make them look like? This didn't even consider the fact of if they dared to. The Void Palace could be considered to be a tier above all other human powers, but it would still be foolish of them to target a member of a prominent family, especially when it was a family of madmen like the Morales. Montez had been banished from the Void Palace long ago, but didn't he still come and go as he pleased? And that was doubly so for Velasco, who had even taken the arm of the young man right before them right now. His edge needs to be dulled, Void Elder Lisbeth spoke lightly. Let things take their course, then, Vimark finished. The three spoke as though they could read each other's thoughts. There was a smooth flowing progression from one to the next, and their words only became more enigmatic as they passed along, as though they were playing some kind of higher dimensional game of telephone. You can go back, child of the Seward family. No need to do anything special, Vimark said. Rosen's gaze flashed, but by the time he looked up, the three elders had already vanished, leaving a shiver in his heart. Rosen was too intelligent to not understand where this was going. Learned too much from his father, edge needs to be dulled, let things take their course. Lionel was the very last to return, while most had returned years ago. Although there were a few that had returned within the last year, it could be said that the bulk of individuals had returned over a decade ago. This made sense. After all, the further away one was from Lionel when the phenomena began, the quicker they were to return. Lionel hadn't met anyone else that was of the Void Palace during the demon hunting event, so the likelihood that anyone was close enough to him to only return recently was very small. Whether it was Lionel or Aina, both of them had come from the most talented generation. In the future, there was no doubt that they'd eventually catch up to those lofty figures who had already surpassed their seniors. However, they would still need the same amount of time that these lofty figures had needed as well. But Lionel was unlucky. He had done a great service to the Void Palace by helping everyone to return and allowing the human domain to have a chance at survival. But in doing so, he had caused him to lag behind by as much as 2 decades in comparison to his peers. Among these peers, there were a great number who were still dissatisfied with the result of the Rapax Nest trials and how Lionel had stopped them all from benefiting. There were the Archer factions who were furious about the loss of their White Lion Bao. There were the Sword factions who were infuriated by the actions of his father back then. And there were even Lionel's own cousins who wanted nothing more than for him to be suppressed as the previously postponed Morales Air Wars were quickly approaching. They as Void Elders had no need to stoop to the point of dealing with a child. Very soon, he would find himself stifled to the point that he may very well beg to enter the mines and obediently dig for a decade. By that point, the information they wanted would be neatly arranged for them on a silver platter. When Rosen came to understand their intentions, his heart couldn't help but tremble. The understanding toward even the present situation of the Void Palace that the Void Elders had was beyond expectations. Even sitting here on their thrones, the entirety of the human domain was still in the palm of their aged hands. Rosen exhaled a breath, but it came out uneven and shuddering. He couldn't help but look inwardly and ask himself how many things he had done in the dark, that were also so clear to them. He rose to his full height and walked out slowly, throwing these matters to the back of his mind. He had a feeling that in these few months, there would be quite some upheaval in the Void Palace, but it wouldn't have anything to do with him. Chapter 1657. Published at 7th of March 2023 3:25 and 52 seconds p.m. Chapter 1657. Changes if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Lionel stepped down from Void Senate Peak with a smile on his face. He didn't really know what actions the Void Palace would take, at least not for certain, but he also didn't care very much. What he was more focused on right this moment was, as he said, squeezing out all the potential the Void Palace had to offer him. What do you want to do? Aina asked. Well, the Void Palace is good for training and for gathering up resources. I have a lot of resources at my fingertips now, but they're mostly in one box. I still need a lot of other things. Right now, we have the demon corpses, we have the Dream Star Gathering Beast Formation, the Focus Crystals and the Perfection Stone. Of those, the Perfection Stone and Focus Crystals are very important for our training, but we only have enough of those for the 2 of us. I can't build up our faction like that, especially since I have to catch up on a lot of lost time. Beyond that, most of my wealth is in ores, even most of the wealth my mother left for me is in Herb Oregon. While it's useful, they're ironically in a state that's too liquid. There were 2 major problems that those running an organization faced, and both were opposite sides of the same coin. The one that was most obvious was having too little money, but on the other hand, having too much money was also another problem. If you let money sit without doing anything, it was as good as not having it at all. The best organization heads were able to maximize the resources they had on hand and would usually spend almost as soon as they received. Only by money constantly exchanging hands in a cycle could an organization maximize growth properly. Of course, Lionel didn't believe he had reached such a state. In fact, I have too little money. But even though his fortune was small, he still hadn't made the best use of it just yet. Still, that's a problem for another time. Right now, since my focus is to squeeze the Void Palace for all it's worth, then the main task isn't to make my funds less liquid, but actually to increase that. At the same time, we also need to maximize our strengths and knowledge. First, I need to return to the Void Library. But in order to do that, I'll need a lot of Void points and Void merits. So the first thing we need to do is do some missions to exchange for an entry token. Aina nodded and smiled. Okay. Last time Lionel entered the Void Library, his mind had already been at the pinnacle of the 7th dimension, but he could hardly make use of it. Firstly, he had still been in the 5th dimension, so his mind was shackled by chains that had greatly loosened now. In addition, he had yet to form the star runes that he had now. Lionel believed that his performance would be much better now in comparison to the past. In fact, he was hoping that he could assimilate all the information in the Void Library. By Lionel's calculations, he was actually still far from being able to accomplish this. However, he had a feeling that pushing himself in the Void Library would help him gain more inklings into how to properly manipulate his dream force. If he could find those inklings, then his odds of success would be far greater. If he assimilated the entire Void Library. Well, as they say, knowledge was power. Lionel and Aina wasted no time and immediately went to a Senate branch. Just like the past, they were all dotted all across the Void Palace. However, when Lionel and Aina attempted to trade for missions, they were stunned by the result. Sorry, there are no Void Star missions, or any missions for that matter, that meet up to your requirements. Lionel blinked when he heard this, not quite understanding. No Void Star missions? How was that even possible? Seemingly seeing Lionel's confusion, the Senate branch overseer assumed that Lionel and Aina were two recently promoted nominal disciples who were just trying to look at Void Star missions for fun. It would make sense why they were in the dark about these matters if this was the case. Often, it took the most ordinary of nominal disciples decades to climb up from their ranks and reach the main Void Palace. So, even though it had been years since everyone had all returned, they wouldn't quite understand the situation. It could be said that this overseer had a relatively good temperament. If anyone else had made such an assumption, they would have already tried to chase Lionel and Aina away. In recent years, all of the Void Star missions have been cleared by the constellation stars. About a decade or so ago, they all started a competition between themselves and the result was all of the Void Star missions, and even the Void Death missions, all being cleared. Even the higher level sector ranked missions weren't safe. The overseer sighed, shaking his head. Most of his generation felt the exact same way. That generation was simply too outstanding, and the geniuses of Earth that followed after them were just as outstanding as well. The Void Star and Void Death missions had withstood the test of time for so long, and yet in just a couple decades, they had all vanished, forcing the Void Palace to not only adjust their difficulty ratings, but to also add special rewards for high difficulty missions. Unfortunately, due to the change in the rules, pretty much all high difficulty missions are monopolized by the constellation stars and their factions and parties. They have a direct line to the Void Senate, so the missions are snatched up before they can even appear here. The overseer shook his head. Anyway, I'm sorry I can satisfy your curiosity. There are still many normal missions to pick from here. They'll allow anything they aren't interested in to slip through the cracks. The overseer smiled and began pulling out missions he felt were on Lionel and Aina's level. But before he could continue, Lionel reached out a hand to stop them. They monopolize missions? And what if I want one of those monopolized missions? The overseer blinked. Well, that would be a bit troublesome. Although it's not explicitly stated in the rules, due to the ambiguousness of the change, claiming missions has become a free-for-all and there are certain unspoken rules now. There are many more so-called high-difficulty missions now because of Earth and its zones appearing all over the human domain. There are even signs that Earth's world will swallow up almost half of the human domain with its next evolution. There's also a lot of covert activity in the shadows by the cloud race and other enemies of humanity to contend with. But despite the sheer number of high-difficulty missions there are, the demand for them is even greater. So now, there are battles to decide who can claim them, but even entering to witness these battles is a very exclusive right, let alone participating in them. Are you interested in viewing these battles for missions? I'd have to advise you against it. The tickets are too expensive, and just buying them in the first place requires a certain degree of prestige. Lionel frowned. To think that there would be so many changes. Important announcement below. Chapter 1658. Published at 7th of March 2023 3:25 and 49 seconds p.m. Chapter 1658. Reset. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel took a breath and exhaled. It seemed that things would be more annoying now. He didn't think that after consuming hundreds of thousands of years of passed-down laws, that just 20 or so years would be enough to change so much. But if what this overseer was saying was correct, these laws didn't even appear alongside the other ones. Due to the suddenness of the change, it had become a loose, law of the jungle type situation. Lionel didn't believe that if he checked the laws now that there would be something that allowed the monopolization of missions, so it could only be said that this was being tacitly allowed for the moment due to extenuating circumstances. After a moment of thought, Lionel turned to Aina. Check to see how many void merits you have. Aina nodded and brought out her own disciple badge, but when she did so, the overseer was startled. Void merits? Did these two confuse void merits with void points? Due to the changes, void merits had become even more of a rarity than they had in the past. With the most difficult missions being monopolized by a very small minority, the chances regular students had at earning void merits had dwindled significantly. The result of this was an already rare currency, becoming even rarer. If you weren't the pinnacle of your rank, the chances of you having void merits was almost nil. However, the overseer remained quiet and still checked, only to be shocked into silence. 21-24 void merits. The overseer looked toward Lionel and Aina again, suddenly understanding that he had made a mistake, a very big mistake. It had to be understood that even one void merit was extraordinarily difficult to procure. To have 100 would mean that you were in the percent of the 1%, if not even greater. He didn't even know how to categorize someone who had over 1,000. However, what confused him even more was that when he said this number, Lionel and Aina didn't look happy at all. In fact, when they looked toward each other, there was an unconcealed dissatisfaction. It was clear that they had thought of the same thing at the same time. 21-24 void merits? According to Lionel's calculations, Aina should have over 50,000 void merits by now. He had already done the calculations before. She received 27 void merits for her place on the current leaderboards and 150 for her place on the all-time leaderboards. At 177 void merits apiece, multiplied over the 23 years they had been gone, plus the 1 year Lionel spent training his spear, that should accumulate to over 50,000. This math was so easy for Lionel that he didn't even need a single second to finish them. The moment that he heard the number started with a 2, he had realized that there was an issue. 21-24 void merits was exactly the amount of void merits that Aina would have for 1 year. But they had been gone for over 2 decades and the Void Palace should have been re-established long ago. With this being the case, how could Aina have so few void merits? You too. The overseer shuddered, it clicked for him in an instant. You two just returned? It finally made sense. The only way one could accumulate so many void merits was through the use of the leaderboards. At the same time, this would explain their dissatisfaction. They were definitely expecting to see more than they got. Yes, we did just return. Can you explain to us why my girlfriend's merits aren't adding up? It wasn't just the number that was lacking. If the Void Palace chose not to count the 2 or so decades, the number Aina had was actually too high. After all, Lionel and she had used some of it before the cataclysm. But this number was exactly enough for 1 year, and then it stopped. Why was that? I see. When the first batch returned from the zone, not everything snapped back into place immediately and a lot of this was unorganized. It wasn't until a good portion of the Void Elders returned that we finally gained a semblance of order. Due to this, a lot of things had to be shuffled around and reset. For those on the leaderboard, all void merits were wiped and everyone received exactly 1 year worth of what they should have, before you had to work for everything all over again. This was also necessary because things like the Void Tower and the previous gold and amethyst tokens rules didn't work particularly well for the Cataclysm generation. The Cataclysm generation? Lionel raised an eyebrow. Yes, that generation is the last to enter the Void Palace right before the Cataclysm struck, so that's the name they go by. As the story goes, there was a Lionel Morales who ruined a lot of things. Word said that he received an amethyst token without properly earning it, and then he entered the Void Tower and reached a floor level that didn't make any sense. In addition, that generation had a lot of talents that would have been amethyst token wielders in almost any other generation. So because of the pressure the human domain was under, the Void Senate thought it best to provide these geniuses a fast track. Thus, a compromise was struck. On the one side, those that came before gained a year worth of resources they earned all at once, while on the other side, all those of the Cataclysm generation that proved themselves worthy through the Cataclysm event were allowed to become galaxy-ranked disciples directly by undergoing the Void Tower trials. Due to that, the leaderboards were cleansed and everything was reset once again, and that's why we have the situation we do now. Lionel's gaze flickered with a cold light. The Void Senate, huh? Lionel's placid expression gave way to an icy smile. So the Void Tower was reset? How interesting. Chapter 1659. Published at 7th of March 2023 3:25 and 48 seconds p.m. Chapter 1659. Border Patrol. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel and Aina left the Senate branch, their destination all too obvious, the Void Tower. However, as though they were being led by the nose, they found yet another roadblock ahead. Lionel was already having a hard time not being visibly annoyed. The surroundings of the Void Tower made Lionel feel as though he was asking for amnesty. It was impossible to tell that this was a core region of the Void Palace that was once frequently visited by students because it practically had a border patrol now. Judging by everything else that had happened until this point, Lionel didn't even need to make too many guesses as to what was happening. Just like all the missions before them, Lionel assumed that the spots of entry into the Void Tower were being monopolized by the so-called Cataclysm generation. In the past, people would only rarely enter the Void Tower. This was firstly because exiting meant that you had experienced something akin to death. It would feel just as real and the real thing. And secondly, there was no point in continuously entering the tower due to the fact one would usually only do so when they had a great improvement in their strength. Of course, none of this even talked about the fact that only the first entry into the tower was considered to be free, while every subsequent entry cost both void points and void merits. After all, the Void Tower was considered to be a cultivation resource. But now with so many geniuses appearing that were outside the bounds of the Void Palace's normal understanding, they entered far more frequently and demanded much more space. It also seemed like there was an entry capacity limit of 3 for the Void Tower as well, something that Lionel hadn't been aware of until he casually listened in on a few conversations. I managed to get a slot for 7 months from now. That's not bad. If I had tried 5 years ago, the waiting time would have been even worse. It looks like they're slowing down. Slowing down? More like they're getting bored of the Void Tower. They used to go at it almost every day, multiple times a day before. Now it's only rarely. I don't know if bored is correct. The deaths on the higher floors are so much more gruesome. It's probably better for their health if they experience them less. Now you're just assigning your own fears to them. The truth is probably that they've reached a bottleneck. If they want to progress any further, they'll have to enter the 7th dimension first. I think that if we want to use some of the best resources of the Void Palace, this window while they're stuck at the peak of the 6th dimension is the best chance we'll get. I'm going to go and register for Sword Faction placements too right after this. I think I'll get a good date. Hearing these conversations, Lionel was truly speechless. In reality, the Void Palace had always been a somewhat lawless zone where students were allowed to butt heads and fight over resources, but this was even more exaggerated than what he remembered. They weren't just fighting over resources here, it had reached a point where they very obviously monopolized them. At the same time, the so-called geniuses of the Void Palace who were once prideful and used to peacocking, just seemed to accept it all so easily. If Lionel had been there when the Void Elder spoke of dulling his blade, he would have understood that this was why they were so confident it would happen. This was already his 3rd or 4th attempt at just doing something, anything in this place, and yet he kept running into roadblock after roadblock. Every time this happened, Lionel's good mood after having spent the last several days in leisure with Aina became darker and darker. Lionel couldn't help but remember the first thing that happened when he stepped foot into the Void Palace. This place, designed for the future leaders of humanity, created to curate the geniuses of the future, acted to crush their spirits before it did anything else. Lionel still remembered it. Back then, despite knowing that anarchic force corroded clothing, the overseers told them nothing and simply allowed it to happen. They wanted to strip them all naked, as though in this place, they had to beg even for clothing. Now, it seemed that sort of emasculation, that sort of infantilization, was pushed to the point where everyone here just thought it to be normal. Crush the normal geniuses, force them to lower their heads, only allowing the truly outstanding ones to stand out. No, it was even worse than that, because even if you were an outstanding genius, while you were growing, you would still need to lower your heads to those that were much older than yourself. Lionel felt like he was watching a microcosm of everything he absolutely abhorred about society playing out for him in real time, and by the time he made it to the first checkpoint for entry into the Void Tower, his expression was as dark as thunder clouds. High above in the air, Cornelius had been following Lionel for a long while. The moment news of him being back was disseminated, he was once again given this task. Seeing the dark look in Lionel's eyes, he sighed and rubbed his forehead. "Here we go again," he mumbled. "Would you like to register for a future spot of entry into the Void Tower? Or would you like to pay for a spectating ticket? The prices for tickets based on those participating is on the left, the price for spots depending on how long you're willing to wait is on the right. Currently, there are no normal tickets left for today's spectators as they've all been bought up. The only spots left are for VIP spectators. However, the price is expensive as the lineup today is quite good." At the checkpoint, a young man spoke with a bored voice without even looking up. It seemed that he had repeated these words again and again until he was simply tired of it all. But what he didn't expect was for a shadow to pass by him without a word. Chapter 1660. Published at 7th of March 2023, 3:25 and 46 seconds p.m. Chapter 1660. Dare? If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Adelon was startled. He had indeed become a bit bored of this job because it was nothing but repeating the same things over and over again. While watching money he had no fate with being exchanged. However, as a member of one of the Cataclysm factions, he had great pride in his heart to be able to step foot in this place at all. He hadn't been in the Void Palace previously, and actually came after the Cataclysm generation. As such, this Void Palace was the only one he knew, and he most definitely didn't recognize Lionel and Aina. All he knew was that while this wasn't the first time someone had tried to disrupt the status quo, they all had the very same ending. Stop. Adelon shot to his feet, the intent in his eyes blazing. Although he could call the guards over, with how boring this job was, how could he not want to take action personally? Plus, relying on guards wasn't necessary in the slightest. Weren't they all geniuses here? In addition, while the Cataclysm generation was the most famous, the generations that came after were very well known for their talent as well, especially as the influence of Earth spread further and further, and more geniuses began to be born beneath the halo, a world with a high degree of potential. Adelon himself was from quite a famous generation, one that entered 2 years after the Void Palace was officially re-established. As such, he was well into the 6th dimension and the strength he had at his fingertips was not small in the slightest. It was just that he wasn't a very prominent figure of his own generation, or else how could he be manning a kiosk? His fist whistled over not even an instant after his words fell, but his roar alone had caught the attention of countless individuals. Although this wasn't exactly a quiet space, the roar of a 6th-dimensional genius couldn't be underestimated. The coldness in Lionel's eyes only flickered with more intensity. It seemed that it was true that no one remembered him, but then again, could he blame him? Even back then, how famous had he been? He was still considered to be a small-time disciple, a very long way from the sector rank and even longer from the domain rank. It couldn't be said that his name was enough to call forth winds and bring forth thunder. But this time, he would make sure that it did. Lionel's head turned back and he raised a single palm. He didn't push out, nor did he apply any strength forward, he simply raised it, almost as though he was helping Adelon to spar and not seeking to harm him at all. Adelon's fist plowed forward with even more force when he saw this, but when the collision occurred, bang! Adelon froze before a miserable shriek echoed through the air. In that moment, it felt as though every bone in his arm had suddenly crumbled to dust. He fell back, frothing at the mouth and collapsing under the shocking pain. Countless gazes turned over and shock colored their faces. That kiosk worker, wasn't he a member of the Lion Pride faction? Who dared to hurt him like this? No, more importantly, who could harm a member of the Lion Pride faction so easily? Even their desk workers were experts among experts. While the crowd was thinking this, Lionel simply looked down at Adelon's convulsing body. He's barely at the standard of a middle-class demon. Even if he released his god runes, he'd be comparable to a higher-class demon at best. Is this what all these people yielded to? Lionel turned away and didn't give Adelon another glance. With the shrill screech of Adelon still echoing in the air, the so-called guards were all alerted. Today was the turn of the Lion Pride faction to take guarding duties over, and as such, they were all part of this very same faction. What is going on over here? The voice rang out like a thunderous boom, but before he could even get an answer, Lionel pierced out with 2 fingers. It was as though Lionel couldn't be bothered to deal with any more nonsense. Every time he tapped at the air, blood would fly and cries would follow. His pace forward didn't pause even the slightest, but he wasn't fast either. It was like he was taking his time to ensure that this was imprinted onto the memories of all those who saw it. Members of the Lion Pride faction fell one after another. Some lost arms, some lost legs, some were punctured right through their chests, and there were even some who suffered wounds to their necks that left them in a frozen state of panic, feeling as though their lives had just flashed before their eyes. Regardless of which category they fell under, none dared to take another step, and yet the commotion only grew larger and larger to the point that even those surrounding the Void Tower in the depths were alerted by it. Lionel approached the second checkpoint. It was clear that these factions and parties had set up multiple such points to ensure that no one could sneak in. To enter, one would be verified, and then verified again, for a total of 3 checkpoints before entering the core region. Lionel's slow steps toward this second checkpoint placed a formless weight on those forming a barrier around it, a suffocating pressure threatening to squeeze all of the life out of them. A hidden purple fog danced within Lionel's eyes. And if one looked even deeper, it was possible to see it rotating about and caressing the body of a golden tablet. The presence of this purple fog seemed to project out the emotions in Lionel's chest. The skies became even darker and gloomier than usual, the ground became more black than gray, and the air became heavy, even a single breath needing all of one's strength as though a mountain was weighed down upon their chests. Bang! Right then, a young man with wild golden hair that almost looked like the mane of a lion bounded over with a single leap. Lionel had met people of this family before. Conan and Gunter were both the geniuses of the Leo family who participated in the selection with him, and he had exchanged some particularly foul words with Conan, while Gunter was more of a quiet individual. This young man here was neither of those two, but he exuded the wild aura of someone in Tier 4 of the 6th dimension. And yet, the pressure he gave off was far beyond that of the likes of Triana, who had been surpassed by the generations that came after her. Who are you? There are still people who dare do such things after so long? The young man's voice rumbled like thunder. When others saw him, their blood seized. It seemed that it wasn't a lie that special characters would be participating today, or else someone like him wouldn't appear here. He was of the same generation as Adelon, but the difference between them was akin to night and day. In fact, he had already entered Tier 7 once before he learned a special technique that allowed him to compress his god foundation and purify it. He was none other than Darien Leo, one of the few geniuses that could contend with the Cataclysm generation. Chapter 1661. Published at 7th of March 2023 3:25 and 44 seconds p.m. Chapter 1661. Lion's Roar. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Darien had the robust and stout figure all the men of the Leo family seemed to share. His aura was brazen and his presence arrogant. However, between Conan and Gunter, he seemed to be far more like the latter in that his disposition was quite untalkative and uncaring. If it wasn't for the given situation and the fact he truly did not recognize Lionel, he wouldn't have even bothered to say so much. But as things stood now, Lionel wasn't in a very talkative mood. He continued to walk forward, his left hand in his right, and his own right hand still raised into the air. With a gentle tap, the wind rippled once again, a spiral of golden spear force manifesting like swirling rays of light that formed a vacuum in the air before speeding forward like a bullet out of a gun. Darian's eyes narrowed. When in the presence of a dense anarchic force, attacking from a distance was incredibly difficult. This was why archers were among the absolutely strongest experts the Void Palace had on hand, purely due to their being better equipped than others to deal with these challenges. To attack from a distance using not bow force, but spear force, was an absolutely rare concept. Although the distance that separated the two of them was no more than 8 to 10 meters, it was still enough of a gap to be insurmountable to most. Under normal circumstances, at least 80% of the Void Palace's disciples would have to close this distance in hopes of entering a bout of close combat. So just from Lionel's actions alone, Darian had already concluded that he wasn't normal. It also had to be taken into consideration that distance was a relative matter. The higher you were in dimensions, the more even seemingly large distances were completely irrelevant. In a pinnacle 7th dimensional world like this one, 8 to 10 meters to a 5th dimensional existence was a large one. But to a 6th dimensional existence, it was already worth no more than a single step. If not for anarchic force, it would be a pitiful gap. But this truth only made Darian's eyes narrow further. At that moment, a golden ray enveloped Darian's body and he shot out a powerful punch, his thoughts not impeding the speed of his movements in the slightest. His gaze flashed with a ruthless light, the speed of his fist suddenly accelerating while it was already deployed. Bang! Fist and spear force met, the sound of the collision causing the ground to rumble. Dong! 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 Darian's expression warped as he was forced to take 3 heavy steps backward. The echoing of his footsteps filled in the harsh silence that suffused the air, the spectators watching with their hearts trembling. Lionel had attacked with his spear force at a distance and Darian had waited until it was in range to use his fist force in the most optimal range for himself. The former had weakened itself and hadn't even made use of a weapon, all while facing the latter which was in its strongest state. And yet this was still the ultimate result? How was that possible? Lionel's footsteps never paused, the distance between them being increased to 15 due to Darian's retreat, only to be cut down to 10 again by Lionel's slow and deliberate approach. Darian met Lionel's gaze, but all he saw was an indifferent coldness, a depth of unfathomable air that made it feel more like he was facing a towering behemoth as opposed to a young male human. His heartbeat slowed and his blood ran cold for a moment before a rush of golden force rushed through his veins, causing his skin to redden and his body temperature to skyrocket. Darian released a roar, veins popping across his forehead and his body growing a size as his muscles bulged. At the same time, his wild golden hair fluttered wildly, truly becoming like the man of a lion. Clang! Chink! PSSS! The sound of armor snapping into place resounded as Darian's god runes and golden force fused into one, manifesting into a radiant defense that seemed one part beast fur and another part refined white gold metal. However, regardless of which part of it was in question, all of them had god runes floating about them, exuding a tremendous aura. Lionel continued to walk forward, his palm flipping over to reveal a spear that was an even more radiant white gold. Just the harpoon-like blade alone shimmered as bright as stars, radiating out with a light so blinding that it seemed to split the natural gloominess of the Void Palace in two. Darian slammed his gauntlet-covered fists together, a rippling force of gold spreading out into the surroundings with a mighty and unrestrained air. He stomped the ground, hard. His hair rose into the skies and the roar of a beast left his lips. With a twist of his torso and hips, he unleashed one of his absolute strongest fists. In the surroundings, the weak fainted one after another, unable to withstand the roar. It felt as though consciousnesses had been gripped by the jaws of a lion and crushed with a single bite, their gazes falling into darkness. Those that were further away were lucky enough to rush back to avoid the brunt of the effects, but even then, they felt their knees go weak. They knew all too well that this was one of the most basic abilities of the Liu family's famous lion pride lineage factor. However, at that moment, Lionel only casually pierced out with his spear. It looked as though he had done nothing more than tap at the air. Despite the fact he was using a spear now, the feeling was just as casual, just as unbothered, just as unhurried. And yet, the entire world seemed to fall into silence beneath the presence of that spear strike. The wind grinded to a halt. The churning black clouds above stopped moving. Darian's roar was silenced. There was only a single ray of gold that appeared before the Liu family youth's chest in a single blink, piercing past his fist and through him as though he was nothing more than the very air that had come to a stop. Chapter 1662. Published at 7th of March 2023 3:25 and 28 seconds p.m. Chapter 1662, Timeless Relics of the Past. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Darian froze, his fist still hanging out in a punching position, but its momentum having already been stripped away. He looked down at his chest, his body quivering once before he fell to his knees. He coughed, blood flowing from his mouth like a waterfall as his radiant armor dimmed and lost its corporeal air. And then, it vanished entirely, his consciousness wavering under the intense pain. Shockingly enough, though, this pain didn't come from his wound. Lionel's spear force was so concentrated, so fast, so swift, that it made it feel as though he was poked through by a needle. He probably wouldn't even notice the problem until several more seconds passed by. No, what was truly the intense pain was that he had lost in a single strike to someone who was 3 tiers beneath him in strength. This wasn't something he could even fathom. He had always thought that the only reason the Cataclysm generation could suppress him was because they were older and of higher tiers than him. He thought that there was no one who could match him at the same level, even them. But today, that dream came crashing down, harshly. The worst part was that Lionel's steps still hadn't paused. He took Aina's hand, not sparing Darian another glance as he crossed the second checkpoint, his spear having already disappeared as though he had regretted taking it out in the first place. Darian could be considered a decent talent. However, he was still someone that Lionel felt that he could have defeated back when he was in Tier 9 of the 5th dimension so long as he went all out and used his Scarlet Star Force. At best, he was firmly within the standard of higher class demon and wasn't nearly enough for the current Lionel to take with any sort of seriousness. The more he saw of these geniuses that could suppress the rest of the Void Palace, the more Lionel realized just how large the gap between the human domain and that zone was. Lionel and Aina approached the third checkpoint, but by this point, no one dared to casually block their way. Even the so-called guards didn't make a move, their eyes still locked onto the sorry state of Darian. If Darian couldn't last even a single move, what good were their numbers, exactly? They would just find themselves crushed. If someone was going to stop Lionel, it would have to be those VIP guests that had already entered the core region, or maybe even one of the participants for today's events. If they got injured, who was going to help them? Their faction would help a bit, but it would still mostly rely on themselves. The most dangerous state any disciple could be in when within these mountains was injured. The Void Palace was a dog-eat-dog world. How could they put themselves at risk in a battle they knew for certain that they would lose? It was then that Lionel crossed the third checkpoint and the individuals of the core region who had heard the commotion finally came to make their presences known. It had been too long since anyone had dared to stir up a commotion in a region controlled by the Cataclysm generation. Never had they expected that today of all days, something like this would actually occur. However, when they laid eyes on who it was, most tilted their heads in confusion. Who the hell was this? Tier 1 of the 6th dimension? Was this a newly admitted disciple? That wasn't impossible. The most recent recruitment selection wasn't too long ago and those freshmen should have just been allowed in. It wouldn't be unreasonable for one of them to have broken through into the 6th dimension in that time. Some of the older participants of the selection often spent years suppressing themselves in wait for the God Path breakthrough method. They looked toward one another to see if there was any among them who had a definitive answer, but all they saw was mutual confusion. It seemed that none of them were aware. The crowd, though, was well aware of the faces of these individuals. Cristal Terrius of the Terrius family. He was in Tier 5 and he was an extremely talented individual of the Biyao Constellation Alliance. If Nazag was considered to be in a tier all to his own in terms of archery talent, then Cristal shared the tier right below along with a few others. Quaner Pius of the Pius family. She was in Tier 6, and if Simona was considered to be in a tier all to her own, Quaner could also be considered to be a tier right below. Wimlan Taurus of the Taurus family. He was by far the tallest of them all and standing at a height that approached 2.5 meters tall. His arms and legs were impossibly thick and he had an odd pair of shin guards that were actually a pair of radiant brass battle axes. No matter who you looked at in this group, each one was more powerful and prestigious than the last, and though they weren't a part of the Cataclysm generation, they weren't too far away. Although none of the generations following the Cataclysm generation could match up to them, it was well known that the generations that came after were far more powerful on average than the usual batches of students the Void Palace received. This was in part due to Earth's rise, but it was also said that the human domain sensed the danger it was in and was reacting appropriately. Maybe very soon, there would be a generation which even the Cataclysm generation couldn't hold a candle to. Among these individuals, though, there was one who didn't come after the Cataclysm generation, but instead came before. Even though everyone was excited by what was fresh and new, this was only in regard to the holistic picture. There were still timeless experts of generations gone by that stood at the same peak at the Cataclysm generation, and this individual was the only one among the entire group that recognized Lionel. He stood tall, his arms crossed about his chest, watching as Lionel approached with a cold indifference in his eye. This individual was none other than Valor Morales, 6th Nova. "So you've returned," he said coldly. Chapter 1663. Published at 7th of March 2023 3:25 and 25 seconds p.m. Chapter 1663. Small families. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel looked toward Valor, his expression still placid. He was the only one of the Morales family not recognizable at a single glance, but the others were all too easy to get a look at. The bronzed hair, tanned skin, pale green eyes. It was all the exact same. It didn't seem to matter who their Morales parent chose to tie the knot with, the Morales genes always seemed to win out. Lionel had been the same in the past until certain mutations in his lineage factors caused changes to occur, but this wasn't too difficult to accept. After all, considering Earth's talent, the lineage factors birthed from there were most definitely not normal. Maybe it would take such a thing to finally make the Morales genes take a step back. The crowd was shocked when they heard Valor speak. They all knew of this young man and his stature was no less than that of the Cataclysm generation. In fact, there was no doubt that the 6 potential heirs of the Morales family were all kings amongst men. It was just that being the young, Valor was the last to have yet to step into the 7th dimension, but even so, he was only a step away. While the Void Palace counted generations by the year, the Morales family counted generation by grandfather, father and son pairings, with decades being in between. Any one of their billions of descendants that could earn the right to fight for the position of heir was an absolute monster, and they had proven this with time. Lionel had already been far behind them when he finally made it to the Void Palace in the first place, but he was placed even further behind after losing 20 years. Valor was probably the only one among them that he still stood a good chance against in a one-on-one battle. However, even with this being the case, Lionel met his cousin's gaze without much fluctuation. "The heir wars were postponed for your sake. The family was quite confident that you would return." Lionel's expression flickered, a bit of his indifference receding. He could tell after these short few sentences that the coldness Valor was exuding had little to do with him, this was just his cousin's personality. Since he was willing to talk, there really wasn't a problem with doing so. The Morales heir wars had been postponed due to the events of the Cataclysm. Usually, they would ensure that the heirs' wars would occur while all of the heirs were still in the 6th dimension, but this time, it had been impossible to allow this. The current plan is to wait until we all enter the 7th dimension, or else it won't be very fair. So we will all be waiting for you. Lionel paused before nodding lightly. He hadn't expected this. He had entered into this matter assuming that it would all be unfair, and he was prepared for that outcome. But it seemed that the Morales family had no intention of allowing things to be so skewed. Valor nodded back. You want to enter the Void Tower? Yes, that was my intention. Lionel responded. Okay, then enter. No one will block you. The expressions of the others had been a mix between shock and interest while they were listening to the two speak. But when they heard Valor's final words, their expressions changed. Valor, you can't just do what you want. The spots today are already claimed. What exactly do you mean by this? Wimlin spoke immediately. With Wimlin's size, despite the fact he only felt that he was talking with a normal amount of sternness, his voice came out in a thunderous boom that caused vibrations in the air. Valor turned an indifferent glance toward Wimlin but didn't say a single word. Rules? Spots? Did he ever have to pay attention to such stupid things? He had strolled in here just like Lionel had because he happened to have some time on his hands today. The only difference was that no one had dared to stop him because they all recognized his face. It was unfortunate for Lionel that he had just returned, or else most would probably give him the same amount of face. Unfortunately, even if people recognized him now, it was unlikely that they'd do so. He hadn't built up enough of a legend before the cataclysm, and now he had lost 20 years compared to the others. Seeing that he was so blatantly ignored, Wimlin's temper flared, his battle axe shin guards shining with a radiant light as they seemed to want to unsheath themselves. However, the moment they did, a raging tempest of spear force surged around Valor. Even with his arms crossed about his chest, it seemed that he could pierce Wimlin through with a single look. Right then, it felt like the very light of Wimlin's battle axes dimmed considerably. Wimlin's expression along with the others turned incomparably ugly. Valor was in Tier 9 while the strongest of them was still in Tier 7. But even if they had been at the same level, they wouldn't have dared to casually take Valor on. At that moment, Quanner, one of the few women among them, spoke. Her approach was much different than the brutish Wimlin. I see. So in that case, this must be 7th Nova and your younger cousin, HM? I've heard that he's very famous, but little of it actually has anything to do with him. The first thing you think of when you think 7th Nova is his father and the latter's tyrannical ways, even chopping off the arm of a Senate Party leader, how valiant. The second thing you think of is his mother, a goddess for sure, but also a woman who let her son earn an amethyst token through some backdoor methods. The third thing you think of is his uncle, a war god amongst men, and aunt, yet another goddess, who both also happened to let him use the Spear faction's facilities for absolutely free for an entire year. And now it seems that he wants to rely on another family member again? You can do as you please, Valor. We all know that we aren't strong enough to stop you. But your Morales family seems to be getting more and more tyrannical every day, flouting the laws of the Void Palace and acting as you please. Now, you know very well who's quartered the Void Tower for use today, but you're still choosing to do this. It seems that the Morales family cares very little for the opinions of us small families, HM? Lionel's eyes narrowed. He could care less about Quanner's words. He was a person who could easily get infuriated for the sake of those he cared about, but when someone was being debasing toward himself, he didn't even find it difficult to remain completely indifferent or even entirely ignore it. The trouble was that Quanner's words seemed to be hinting at something far deeper than just a bit of nepotism, and the frightening chill in Valor's eyes, even more frigid than normal, spoke volumes toward that effect. Chapter 1664. Published at 7th of March 2023 3:25 and 23 seconds p.m. Chapter 1664. Buried history. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The coldness in Valor's eyes reached a tipping point. The aura he was exuding made Quanner's confident smile waver as a flicker of fear danced within the depths of her eyes. However, just when it seemed that he was about to do something, Lionel smiled and patted him on the shoulder. Thanks for your help, Valor. I'll take you up on that offer. Me and Aina would like to enter. Valor looked away from Quaner and met Lionel's gaze before nodding lightly. Without another word, Lionel walked into and through the group of young geniuses, his expression not very hurried at all. As far as Lionel was concerned, starting a massacre here wouldn't extend his time in the Void Palace. In fact, it would most definitely shorten it. The larger the commotion he caused, the more rushed his time in this place would be. But he still needed time to squeeze all the benefits he could out of the Void Palace. Although the zone seemed to have much stronger methods, Lionel didn't forego what the Void Palace had to offer either. There were still large riches of information to be had in this place and secrets that he would only be able to understand through it. If he had been able to unearth all of the secrets of the zone in one go, he might care about the Void Palace's things any longer. But he had spent too little time in there. As such, he was still in a situation where he knew too little about the wider secrets of the dimensional verse. In that case, he would make sure to rob the Void Palace of everything it had before he leisurely left with a smile on his face. The youths watched as Lionel crossed their faces without a care. He hadn't even seemed to take Quaner's words to heart. In fact, he completely disregarded them. That said, just because he didn't mean that Aina would as well. After all, didn't she have her own temper? Still holding on to Lionel's hand, she turned back with a dark glow in her eyes. Your elder brothers, sisters and cousins already lost to him once over 20 years ago. I'm afraid that 2 decades still wasn't enough to catch up. Maybe you should ask them what exactly happened in the Rapak's nest. But then again, saving you all wasn't exactly a one-time occurrence, now was it? A coercion-laced mental attack seemed to be hidden within her voice, thrumming against the mind of the youths that were present. Quaner in particular felt her heart jolt, finding, to her horror, that her nose and ears were all bleeding. Aina's words resonated like bells in their skulls, the blood running in reverse and their hearts beating hard to catch up. It felt as though if they were the slightest bit careless, their chests would implode, forming blood flowers that marked the place of their deaths. Information about exactly what had happened in the Rapak's nest had been overshadowed by the actions of Lionel's father that day and the position the Cataclysm generation had taken afterward. Having been stimulated by Lionel and Amory, they went into seclusion, wishing to make a perfect breakthrough into the God path as quickly as possible. Back then, Conan had claimed that breaking into the God path would close the gap between themselves and Lionel's innate node, and it seemed that many of them had agreed with this sentiment. Being spurred on by the fire of competition, they all went into hiding soon after. It was because of this that even after a year in the Void Palace, Lionel hadn't heard anything about the members of his generation, and that included even Amory, who had placed all of his focus toward the Sword Domain's tribulation. At the same time, the Sword faction of the Void Palace didn't want to reveal the details of what caused all of this to happen, or else the Sword family might have to face the ire of many families for putting their children at risk, all for the sake of allowing Amory a chance to gain a second ability index. And, of course, the second mastermind of the matter, Third Nova Zavnik, obviously didn't want to make his involvement clear either, or else the truth about him betraying the Spear faction to help the Sword faction toward his own ends would have also been exposed. Then, this ultimately came to a head when the Cataclysm descended and such small details simply didn't seem to matter at all. Due to this, the one of the Cataclysm generation whose name should have held the most weight, Lionel Morales, was overshadowed. It also didn't help that speculations of nepotism were rampant. However, right this moment, Aina's words seemed to have jolted them all awake. She had, of course, been there. Could it be that their understanding of the situation was flawed? By the time they recovered themselves, Lionel and Aina had already appeared before the disciple manning the Void Tower and handed over their badges. This will be our first entry, Lionel said lightly. With all of their records wiped clean, this would, indeed, be their first entry. Since the Void Palace wanted to play, he would happily play along with them. The disciple hesitated, but sensing the gaze of valor, he could only shiver and accept the badges, inputting them into the system and allowing Lionel and Aina to enter. Not even a half-minute after Lionel and Aina had entered, a commotion arose in the Void Tower region once again. Simona, there's still time to back down. I'm not a fan of crushing women outside the bedroom. Of course, if you want a taste of me, I can lay my pride down and give you a night." The laughter rang out like thunder, booming to the point even the ground quaked. However, the ice beauty who seemed to be the target of it all didn't respond in the slightest. She walked slowly and in an unhurried fashion, and yet her steps carried her forward dozens of meters at a time. She had a beauty beyond words and an elegance surpassing reason. Just the small showing of soft flesh that flashed out of the slit in her dress was enough to make many swoon. Bang! At that moment, a heavy figure fell from the skies. Simona Pius and Conan Leo had arrived. But they weren't alone. Chapter 1665. Published at 7th of March 2023 3:25 and 22 seconds p.m. Chapter 1665. Humiliation. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The third individual was a hulking man, standing at 3 meters tall and dwarfing even Wimlin. He was the genius of the Tor family, Armand Tor. Just like this, 3 geniuses of the Cataclysm generation had appeared one another, each exuding an aura that seemed to make the skies tremble and the earth crack. However, they were surprised to find that the organized region they had become used to was not only in disarray, but Conan even found that several members of the Lion Pride faction were actually bleeding out on the ground. At that moment, Conan's good mood vanished into thin air. "Who dares?" His words came out in a lion-like roar, wisps of golden force shooting out from his lips like a sonic attack. But it didn't even seem like he had done this consciously, it was more like his power had become a part of the very fabric of his being. Conan's gaze almost turned bloodshot, his eyes sweeping over the surroundings until he locked onto Valor and the others who had been approaching the tower to watch. At that moment, Conan's gaze locked onto Valor, the aggression in his expression increasing manifold. In his mind, Valor was the only one with the balls to do such a thing, and he was probably the only one with the power to dare to do so as well. "You did this?" Conan growled. The truth was that Conan's speculations weren't exactly poor. After all, Valor had indeed entered without paying what others did. If someone had been foolish enough to stop him, then this was a very possible outcome. The difference was, though, that no one would dare to act against Valor. However, Conan hadn't been here to see this, so there was nothing particularly wrong about his assumption. And Valor, who was a man of few words to begin with, couldn't even care to explain himself. Even if he did have the mind to explain, he still wouldn't for the mere fact that it would seem as though he was trying to avoid Conan's fury. He, Valor Morales, did not fear the likes of Conan Leo. If the latter wanted to act, he was free to do so. At the same time, Wimlin, Quaner, and the others were already dissatisfied with Valor for obstructing and oppressing them earlier, so why would they be in a hurry to help him clear his name? Conan's steps slowed as he walked forward, but the heaviness behind them only grew with every oppressive push of his gait. The surroundings quaked and even the anarchic force in the air seemed to be showing signs of swaying out of the way as Conan's fury rose like a tempest. It had been very long since anyone dared to provoke him like this. Did his Lion's Pride faction look like something just anyone could trample upon as they pleased? However, just as Conan was about to take action, Simona released a light hum. Her delicate brows rose as she looked up. Right then, 2 large projections manifested themselves, one showing the form of Lionel outfitted in a familiar skin-tight black suit, and another showing Aina wearing the very same thing. Him? Conan's voice was tinged with surprise. Lionel hadn't returned even after so long. So many who knew of his existence thought he had died. Of course, nothing would be confirmed until the spatial storm phenomena came to an end, but to think that he would truly be among the last batch. Many thought that Conan would be enraged that someone had actually dared to take his spot, but in reality, after being surprised, Conan suddenly began to laugh again, his voice booming across the horizon. This was perfect, simply too perfect. Back when the influx of geniuses forced the Void Tower to change its rules and reshuffle things around to better optimize their growth, everyone of the Cataclysm generation had entered one after another. But this wasn't the most important point. What made Conan laugh like he was laughing now was that they had also all entered at Tier 1 of the 6th dimension. If Lionel had just returned like Conan believed he did, this would mean that it had been only a year since he had met Conan, at least from Lionel's perspective. In such a case, Lionel would also, at most, be in Tier 1 of the 6th dimension. This would be an absolutely perfect one-to-one comparison. Conan himself, on that day, had managed to climb to the 42nd floor in one go, a feat that was enough to shock the whole of the Void Palace. For context, the strength of the 7th dimension began at the 50th floor, making his accomplishment at the mere first tier absolutely ridiculous. Of course, Conan hadn't performed the best, but he also claimed that it was because he was unlucky in the floors he was given, something he stood by even to this day. Regardless, if Lionel couldn't at least make it that high, then he was nothing but trash. In that situation, he would no longer have to hold back. Once Lionel came out, he wouldn't have to worry about whining about him having a 20-year advantage because he would have already proven himself to be superior to Lionel. Conan remembered what happened that day in the Rapak's nest all too well, not to mention those arrogant words that Lionel had spoken. Back then, Conan had claimed that humans couldn't coexist with powerful innate nodes and that Lionel would eventually be swallowed up by his own talent in the future. However, in response, he only received Lionel's sneers and derision. In his entire life, Conan had never experienced such humiliation, especially not for an individual of his own generations. "Don't assign limits, you do to yourself to me." Those words and Lionel's brazen smirk were branded into his mind. When he came out, Conan would be sure to grind all of his bones to dust. Chapter 1666. Published at 7th of March 2023 3:25 and 21 seconds p.m. Chapter 1666. For categories, if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel had no idea what was going on outside, nor did he particularly care. If he had known about Conan's thoughts, he would have done nothing more than laugh. Back then, he was aware of Conan's true thoughts. If Conan had been the one born with a Scarlet Star Force innate node, he would have had all the confidence in himself in the world. In such a situation, he wouldn't be talking about humans and spirituals and their gaps. It was only because he felt that Lionel was unworthy that he had said such things. However, didn't Lionel have just as much confidence in himself? Conan could just sit tightly and watch. Lionel sent a gaze toward the weapon racks that manifested around him. He remembered what happened the last time he was here. His arm was broken, so he had no choice but to rely on throwing weapons and shields. For the first time, though, he was completely healthy and he chose nothing. Under the astonished gazes of the spectators, Lionel didn't choose any weapon whatsoever and directly allowed the sequence to begin. His vision spun, and when he appeared once more, he realized that he had stepped into what could only be called the land of the dead. Lionel recognized this place almost immediately. It was because of this region that Aina hadn't been able to continue past the 12th floor during her original run. Because these enemies had no blood force to use, she ended up dying in the end. Now it seemed that it would be Lionel's first batch of 9 floors. The ground splintered and bony hands reached up. However, Lionel only sent a casual glance through the surroundings. People had forgotten his name. It was probably time that they remember. He lightly raised a foot and stamped downward. In that moment, a surge of radiant earth force compressed the ground, forcing it into submission. Silence fell over the spectators on the outside of the Void Tower. Usually, the surroundings would be filled with lively discussion, no different from a sporting event on Earth. After all of these people had paid good money to witness the events of this day, but they hadn't thought that they would see such a thing. Usually, when records were set, they would only appear on the first-time rankings. It had to be remembered that there were 2 batches of rankings, each with 2 categories of their own. There were current rankings and all-time rankings. In addition, both of these categories were separated into first entries and cumulative rankings. Normally, the cumulative rankings were hardly ever touched. This was because those monstrous domain-ranked disciples with 7th dimensional strength also entered the tower, and their speed would be far beyond what those of the 6th dimension could compare to. As a result, most only hoped to earn a name on the first entry rankings. Who would have thought, though, that in one sweep, not even taking half a minute, Lionel would lay claim to 9 of these rankings all at once. The ignorant might say that he had gotten floors that he could easily counter. But how often did such a thing happen? Why didn't others also capitalize like he had? In addition, controlling Earth force in higher dimensional worlds was among the hardest things to do. And yet Lionel had just casually stomped a foot and compressed the Earth in a radius of almost 100 meters to the point of being able to crush 6-dimensional skeletons known for their hardness to death. Just what kind of feat was this? The 3 of the Cataclysm generation fell into silence, their casual expression becoming solemn. Lionel's vision swam as he entered the 10th floor. He remembered this floor all too well. The last time he came to this floor, he lost consciousness, and when he woke up, the Spear Domain heirloom was in disarray and the segmented cube was gone. But at the same time, his mage core had undergone earth-shattering changes and his starry-tailed fox lineage factor had reached completion. Even now he didn't quite know whether to see it as a blessing or a curse. Regardless of which it was, though, this particular boss floor wasn't the same as what Lionel had experienced in the past. At the very least, it wasn't a member of the spirituals race, but was instead a member of the Rapax. Oh. So is this how it works? You face a member of the powerful races every 10 floors? That could be interesting. Lionel smiled lightly and threw out a fist. It seemed all too casual, and yet all the sounds of the world seemed to be sucked away, leaving behind nothing more than the image of a flying fist. Bang! Lionel's fist stopped in the air, a full 20 meters away from the Rapax, and yet it sounded as though it had collided with it perfectly. The air had compressed before his fist to the extent that when it came to a stop, it felt like he had collided against solid steel. In the distance, the Rapax exploded on impact, a shower of greenish-violet blood drizzling down in a fine, misty rain as Lionel stepped into the 11th floor. This time, Lionel didn't beat the all-time record, but the impact of his win was still no less horrifying. Everyone knew that the Morales family didn't specialize in fist techniques and neither did Lionel, that much they knew. This meant that Lionel had only casually decided to use a fist this time, and yet the result was the death of a Rapax at his level from over 20 meters away. Just what was going on here, exactly? Lionel stepped in the 11th floor to find a familiar challenge. It was the heavy gravity floors. Ironically, this had also been his 11th floor challenge back then, but he hadn't been conscious to experience it. This time, however, he would be. His lips curled into a smile. Chapter 1667. Published at 7th of March 2023 3:25 and 18 seconds p.m. Chapter 1667. Churn. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The heavy gravity floors were one of the few that didn't actually require any battle. The first layer of difficulty was, obviously, the heavy gravity. The second layer of difficulty was in the so-called pillars of gravity. These pillars of gravity were regions of this seemingly blank and wide space where the gravity would suddenly multiply by thousands of times and crush you to death in an instant. In order to pass these floors, one had to cross this spacious room without dying, and of course, while withstanding the generally higher gravity as well. It was safe to say, then, that this was another exceptionally lucky draw for Lionel. Even if he had been in the 5th dimension again, he could have crossed this room easily. He rose his foot and his figure flickered, taking an approach most saw as suicide on the heavy gravity floors. And yet, he did it without even thinking twice. Gravity? Why would a member of the Morales family have to fear it? Lionel appeared on the 20th floor, his mood still quite casual. From what he could tell, in 10-floor increments, the Void Tower seemed to jump through 2 tiers of strength at a time. The boss of the 10th floor had been a Tier 2 existence, so it was likely that the boss of the 20th floor would be at Tier 4, which meant that the boss of the 50th floor would be quasi-7th dimensional. However, this standard was set to the average student of the Void Tower. While average to the Void Tower was considered to be genius level to the greater human domain, to the likes of Lionel and the Cataclysm generation, it was child's play and actually quite weak. Of course, things actually weren't quite so simple since the non-boss floors had many enemies of that level to face, while the boss floors themselves faced them off against more concentrated talent. But this was the general gift nonetheless. This was why, even standing on the 20th floor, Lionel didn't even feel a need to take out a spear. Watching as a pixie of the dwarven race flapped her wings and quickly rose into the air, Lionel only pressed out 2 fingers, causing a flash of golden spear force to rush out so quickly that it was almost impossible to track with the naked eye. Before the pixie could even get into place to draw her bow, she froze, her eyes going blank as she fell from the skies, dead. The silence was exceptionally heavy. It seemed that whether it was Lionel or Aina, both of them had no intention of allowing these matters to settle down quietly. Although Lionel had failed to break into the all-time rankings again after the first 9 floors, he didn't waste any time crushing the first-time rankings one after another. The worst part was that he didn't even seem to be putting in his full effort. Even after crossing the 30th floor and beginning to face enemies at Tier 7 and even Tier 8, they didn't seem to be putting in much effort at all. They crushed them one after another, their times still being absolutely ridiculous. By the time Lionel and Aina entered the 40th floor, any smiling and jeering that had been present had become a solemn silence. Back then, when the Cataclysm generation had first entered, the fact that Tier 1 existences could battle against Tier 7 and above existences was hard for most to fathom, but they had slowly come to accept it over time. This was just the new standard for absolute genius. Seeing a new pair of individuals accomplish the same thing, but seemingly with even greater ease, was absolutely shocking, and they weren't sure how to wrap their heads around it. The likes of Wimlin and Quoran had on exceptionally ugly expressions. Although they could climb to these floors as well, and even make it look quite easy too, they were in Tier 6 already. When they were in Tier 1, they couldn't have hoped to be so casual. By the time one entered the 6th dimension, taking even one step forward was incredibly difficult. This was why even after 20 years of being gone, a minority had crossed into the 7th dimension. In reality, for the vast majority of those in the human domain, entering the 6th dimension was nothing more than a dream. As for the geniuses who could make it to the Void Palace, entering the 7th dimension was just as much of a dream to them. Every step was arduous and difficult. But likewise, the benefits for taking such steps was also outstanding, and one gained large amounts of power for each step you took. Crossing levels to do battle in the 6th dimension should be extraordinarily difficult. So why did they make it look so easy? Lionel's and Aina's names flooded the rankings. By the 40th floor, each of them had secured 120 void merits a month at a minimum, and that was just considering the current rankings and not the all-time rankings. If the latter was included, the totals would be even more exaggerated. And yet, they showed no signs of stopping. Lionel entered the 41st floor, a familiar charismatic smile on his face. It seems that I should get a little bit more serious. He reached out a hand, causing a surge of emulation spatial force to manifest. Soon, it solidified, forming a jet black spear. A pulse of light radiated from Lionel's forehead and a golden crown formed and wrapped around his head, its centerpiece being a radiant golden spear. Lionel stood in a world of a vast ocean. As far as even his own eyes could see, there was nothing but crystal blue waters. Until, that is, the skies began to rumble and the water began to churn. Chapter 1668. Published at 7th of March 2023, 3:25 and 15 seconds p.m. Chapter 1668. The gap. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. This was the first time that Lionel was in a world like this one. It felt ominous and could easily make a person feel small. The vastness of an ocean wasn't something that could be easily fathomed. Even as a person now of the 6th dimension, it still filled Lionel with thoughts of inferiority in a way that even the vastness of space couldn't. However, Lionel still faced it all with a smile, the tip of his spear trembling slightly. Right then, suddenly, and without any sort of precursor, Lionel stepped forward and pierced. His movements were fluid and without hitching, everything about his form touching onto a pinnacle of perfection that most couldn't fathom. With every step he took, the waters rippled. And with every pierce, they split apart. Waves rose and the blue waters rushed upward like a pair of tsunamis, seemingly looking to swallow Lionel whole but being completely unable to crash down around him as his movements only became more and more fierce. 1 step, 2, 3. The creatures lurking in the vast blue ocean couldn't even complete their attacks or surface. The moment they touched the dome of Lionel's senses, he would pierce outward, his motions unhurried and unbothered. His spear force seemed to reap god runes. Mighty constructs that could instill fear in others didn't seem capable of even causing Lionel's expression to change. Whether it was soft and weak flesh or sturdy and hard-scaled, his spear pierced through them all just as easily, a radiant golden light flourishing around him as though he was insistent on becoming the new center of the world. Lionel's spear spun in his hands, a mighty scythe of gold splitting the ocean in two. The water rushed away, only to reveal an enormous leviathan-like creature which didn't even get the chance to roar out in pain before it was split into two, its eyes turning vacant even as the ocean's walls crashed down around it once again. Lionel looked down beneath his feet without much of a change to his expression. Then, he took a step forward, vanishing into the next floor. Lionel could feel the difficulty increasing. It was as though the closer he got to the 7th dimension, the further along an exponential curve that he traveled. The burden placed on him wasn't very great at all. After all, he still hadn't used much more than a fraction of his strength or trump cards. But he could feel that the gap between the floors was steadily growing larger and larger. When Lionel crushed Conan's record, surpassed the 42nd floor, cruising through the 43rd and rushing up the 47th, he finally felt that he was reaching a point where more and more of his strength was being forcefully squeezed out and less of his casual strikes were effective. At the very least, he could no longer just tap the air with a pair of fingers and expect that to claim victory. Everyone watching had expected something like this to happen. The gap between the 6th and 7th dimensions was simply too enormous. Even the likes of the Cataclysm generation, despite having reached the peak of the 6th dimension, wouldn't dare to say that they could face off against even the weakest individual of the 7th dimension, and that was fundamentally because such a saying was an oxymoron. There were no weak individuals who could enter the 7th dimension. They didn't exist. And this was especially so for those who took the God path. Due to the specific characteristics of the God path, improving in it was far more difficult than the conventional path. Someone on the conventional path, so long as they had a bit of talent, could force their way into the 7th dimension through the use of time, effort, and resources, a lot of resources. However, someone in the God path could not do this. No amount of resources could allow you to progress in the God path. The only method of advancing was through comprehension, only then could you accumulate the force necessary for your breakthrough. The leap necessary to cross from the 6th dimension to the 7th was absolutely enormous. Theoretically, even if one had entered the 6th dimension with the God path, you could continue through from Tier 1 to Tier 9 mostly using methods of the conventional path. But, upon reaching the pinnacle, unless your understanding of your God path reached a certain level, it would be a foolish dream to think of entering the 7th. If the 6th dimension was where the beginning of the God path lay, the 7th was where it blossomed and grew, and without proper fertilization and enough soul, this blooming would fail 10 out 10 times. This was the simple truth. As a result of this, there were enormous gaps between 6th-dimensional individuals. This was why members of the Cataclysm generation could fight Tier 7 individuals right out the gate, and also why Lionel and Aina could do so as well. This was a difference in quality in the paths they had taken. Now, Lionel was experiencing this firsthand, because in the quasi-7th dimension was the first quasi-realm where there was a magnitude of difference in the title it held. To be a quasi-7th dimensional existence was akin to be like a demigod among the mortals of the 6th dimension. So when Lionel crossed from the 47th floor into the 48th and felt the pressure radiating from the waters below, his own expression couldn't help but turn cold, his casual smile giving way to something serious for the first time. Lionel stretched his spear out and squeezed his palm, causing it to shatter into motes of light that quickly reformed into the body of a bow. His hair fluttered wildly as a cyclone of water formed beneath his feet. He drew his bow, his back stretched tight and his aura calm. Divide. Shuu Lionel released, the water beneath him splitting before even coming into contact with his bow force. On the other end, a whale the size of a small island had its head shredded into pieces, but Lionel had already drawn his bow once again, ready to fire. Now things were getting fun. Important announcement below. Chapter 1669. Published at 7th of March 2023 3:25 and 12 seconds p.m. Chapter 1669. Not again. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel's battle intent blazed. Everything within the surrounding several kilometer range seemed to be in the palm of his hands. Even the water was completely incapable of impeding his forward progress. It was an all-out slaughter. The moment Lionel grew the least bit serious, nothing seemed capable of withstanding even a single strike. He stood tall and straight, the speed of his aiming and drawing reaching an unconscious level. Those that were watching had already felt that his spearmanship was near untouchable compared to his peers, but it was only now that they came to understand that compared to his archery, all other things fell by the wayside. It was like Lionel's spear was nothing more than scrap paper he used to test out and refine the ideas he had for his bow. All of his abilities seemed to be amplified by a factor of tenfold at a minimum in the presence of his bow. If it wasn't for the fact his emulation bow force wasn't quite as good at emulating bowstrings, his lethality would be on a completely different level. Even with this being the case, with every pluck of his bowstring, Lionel found another flaw and tweaked it. What those on the outside couldn't see was that only a small part of his attention was placed on aiming and firing, with a much larger portion being focused on refining his control over his emulation spatial force. Lionel knew that he was still greatly lacking in comparison to Thela despite his far superior dream force affinity. He was able to mask a lot of his deficiencies because the illusion abilities of his emulation spatial force were so powerful thanks to this affinity of his. However, when it came to manipulating the underlying spatial force, he still needed a lot of work. When creating something like a spear which was in line with the inherent rigidity of emulation spatial force, it was relatively easier. But it was difficult to emulate the tension and flexibility of a bowstring. He even struggled quite a bit with the bow's body as well. While others saw a bow that looked perfect in form, only Lionel, who was actually using the bow, knew that it was actually handicapping his abilities. He would face the same problems if he needed to form a more flexible spear as well. It was possible to circumvent this entirely by using his Aurora domain, but he felt no need to go so far just for a mere void tower. While Lionel planned on absolutely crushing the records of those in his generation, he had no plans of going so far as to expose the true depths of his strength. He had also told Aina to hold back as well. There were definitely individuals watching them from the dark right this moment, but they would never be able to guess at the true depth of strength they possessed, and they would be even more hard-pressed to guess at what kind of strength he and Aina could display when they fought together. That said, Lionel really wanted to experience just what kind of power someone of the seventh dimension. Or, more accurately, he wanted to know what someone who had entered the seventh dimension with the God Path could do. Bang! The ocean churned and roared. For a moment, it looked as though the entirety of its volume was rushing into the air. Lionel stood indifferently amidst it all, a heavy rain falling from above. But at a glance, it was hard to differentiate the drops of blue from the drops of violet, making it impossible to tell the difference between the ocean's waters and the rain of oceanic beast blood. Lionel took a step forward, leaving the depths of the 49th floor and entering the 50th. The outside of the void tower was still shrouded by a deathly silence. Valor watched with the same cold expression. It was difficult to tell exactly what was going on in his mind. However, when it came to Conan, his heart was always worn on his sleeve. The latter's expression was so dark and gloomy that even his golden aura seemed to dim into a dark gold. There was simply no excuse. The oceanic warbeast floors were among the most dangerous for those without water force affinity. In fact, although it wasn't classified as one of the drawing dead floors, it was very close to that for many. And yet, Lionel had made it look easy. Even if he had a water force affinity, he clearly didn't rely on it, never mind the fact that most assumed that his greatest reliance was his earth force due to his identity as a Moralis. For those of the Moralis, this was the absolute worst floor to be given. But, he had actually set a new record. Coron's own expression was quite ugly. If making it to the 40th floor meant that Lionel had earned the right to stand on the same level as them, entering the 50th meant that he had left the likes of her and the others far behind. If it was added that he was only at Tier 1, then only the likes of the Cataclysm generation and the few monsters like Valor even had the right to meet his gaze. However, when Coron saw what opponent Lionel received on the 50th floor, her heart trembled before a bit of the soulness in her heart faded. If it wasn't for the fact that she didn't want to come off as narrow-minded and worried for her image, she would have started laughing uproariously. That said, Cornelius, who was hidden high in the skies, reacted much differently. "Oh no, please not again." He hesitated, wondering if he should forcibly put a stop to things. Lionel appeared in a familiar world of white, facing off against a young man who was too handsome for words. It was as though a goddess had personally refined each and every one of features. But he only seemed to have eyes for the tree by his side and the singular golden apple that hung from it. After a brief moment of surprise, Lionel suddenly grinned wildly. Chapter 1670. Published at 7th of March 2023 3:25 and 11 seconds p.m. Chapter 1670. Clash. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again as spiritual. For the first time since Lionel and Aina had cleared their first floors, a commotion broke out beneath the Void Tower. However, this commotion was more lament than anything else. They wanted to see how far Lionel could go, but they didn't want to see him draw dead so early on. Though, this couldn't be considered early on any longer. A few had heard of what happened last time Lionel had entered the Void Tower, but they were in the minority. A large portion didn't even know the name Lionel Morales outside of the weight the Morales name held until this moment. However, as impressed as they were by Lionel's performance, the legend of the spirituals was simply too deeply ingrained. They were a race of people that stood at the pinnacle of the dimensional verse. If it wasn't for the fact they didn't seem as eager as the other races were to claim a piece of the human domain for themselves, they might have long since fallen. When it came to races that could hold a candle to the spirituals, only the mysterious ones like the void beasts could hope to. But when it came to numbers, many of these races couldn't hope to match up. They had not only the talent, but the numbers. It made them probably the greatest threat in the whole of the dimensional verse. Although no one dared to claim this to be absolutely certain and infallible since the universe was simply too large, no one would argue too fiercely against it either. In the face of the spirituals, the human race was so frail that they couldn't battle unless they brought soul protective treasures with them. If you lacked one, it was an automatic loss. Many wondered why it was that the Void Palace insisted on allowing the spirituals to take part in the Void Tower since they couldn't bring any treasures in with them, but after so long, it had simply become an accepted reality. Now, it was simply known as drawing dead. They could only wait for Lionel to be expelled. But it was then that Lionel's wild grin was projected to them, causing their hearts to jolt. That wild grin. The older generation was all too familiar with it. It was the grin of those madmen of the Morales family. Lionel squeezed his fist, causing the bow construct in his hand to shatter in motes of emulation spatial force. Come. Lionel's voice pervaded the world. In this battle, he didn't want to use his bow or his spear. He wanted to battle this spiritual on its battlefield. At that moment, Lionel's words caught the spiritual's attention, causing it to look from its golden apple toward him. It's over, many mumbled these words to themselves. Many had entered that boss room before and it always ended the same way. So long as you remained silent and unmoving, the spiritual wouldn't care about you. But the moment you made noise or even sneezed, it would look at you and then things would come to an end just that fast. However, bang! A spatial barrier rippled before Lionel's head, shattering the soul attack the spiritual had sent toward him. But, likewise, his spatial barrier shattered as well. However, Lionel's grin only became wider. As expected, he could rely on emulation spatial force to block soul attacks because it was fused with dream force. As such, it could interact with things on a soul level. The spiritual race man tilted his head to the side, seemingly surprised. Last time Lionel had been here, it had reacted the same way when he dodged its attack. But this time, Lionel had taken it head on. He didn't need to rely on this spiritual to attack his soul this time. Right now, he just wanted to crush it. The spirituals were powerful, right? Well, he wanted to see it for himself. Lionel raised his arms, his starry spirit domain flourishing as countless force arts formed in the air. In their midst, the snaking form of a flood dragon took shape, roaring with a menacing light in its eyes. In just a moment, Lionel had not only completed dozens of Camelot mage arts, but also an enormous beast construct, all of which used his Scarlet Star force. Show me what you have. If you don't, I'll burn your tree to ash. Hearing these words, the spiritual's expression suddenly warped, becoming malevolent. In an instant, it had gone from a docile angelic young man to furious war god. His body grew by a size, a towering tempest of green force surrounding his body until it covered his white robes in a radiant wooden armor. In a blink, he went from just about 3 inches shy of 6 feet to over 7 feet. The spiritual rose his own arms, the skies being filled with green gold arrows of force. It was clear that while Lionel had to rely on his dream world to accomplish such a feat, the spiritual relied on nothing more than his own affinity for the elements. Lionel was a bit startled by the change, but then he laughed. This was precisely what he wanted. In a moment, an eruption of force filled the air. 2 young men stood over 100 meters apart, and yet they seemed to control the entirety of the area that separated them. Boom! 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 Fire and wood clashed, and yet Lionel seemed to have no ability to burn the young man's attempts at countering him to ash. He should have had a suppressive ability just due to his elemental advantage, or so he thought, but things simply didn't work out that way. And yet, Lionel's eyes only glowed fiercer and fiercer, his mage arts becoming swifter. With a point of his fingers, several spatial arrows hid under the blasts of his flames, converging toward the spiritual from all sides. Another silence fell over the surroundings of the Void Tower. Watching the fireworks of force, they found it hard to believe that just 2 people could even output so much force. Were they even human? Well, one of them definitely wasn't. As for the other one, they weren't entirely sure anymore. Lionel flipped his palms to the skies, causing 2 balls of fire to appear. In a second, they pulsed to over a foot wide. In another second, they pulsed to over a meter wide. However, with a slight fluctuation and a flicker of his irises, they vanished into thin air. He really wanted to see how far this spiritual could go while wasting half of its power protecting its precious tree. If it didn't go all out, he didn't mind crushing it to dust in the name of all the human youths it had unceremoniously slaughtered until this point. You're tuning in to the Biyao's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.